Chapter 445. Lionel was instantly at a loss. If he continued saving those buried beneath the rubble, many of whom were unconscious, he would be allowing this attack to continue on smoothly. But if he moved to stop them now, it was very likely that many of those he could save would die. Damn it! Lionel roared in his mind. Lionel. Ha! Lionel snapped out of his own thoughts. Just point out where they are to me and I'll dig them out. I can't battle in the skies like you can. Lionel opened his mouth to reply, but wasn't exactly sure what to say. It would definitely be more efficient for them to be saved by him. He could use his earth elemental affinity to simply carry them out. But Aina would have to physically dig them out. Just leave it to me, Aina insisted. More people will die than those buried down if they're allowed to go. Lionel's hesitation was broken when he heard these words. She was right. If they managed to make it to one of the baronies, hundreds would die. Aina pushed off, breaking out of Lionel's embrace and landing on the ground. They can't see me on the ground through all the dirt clouds. Stop worrying about me. Lionel blinked and nodded. The first is 57 meters in that direction and 13 meters underground. With that, Lionel shot into the skies. The formation of predatory birds soared through the skies in perfect formation. They were split into groups of 11. Each group of 11 was split into 3 groups. The first group formed the outer structure of the formation. At the helm, there was 1 bird and following its wings there were 3 birds to each side for a total of 7 forming this outer structure. This first group formed an inverted V structure. The second group was likewise in a V structure, but they were tucked within the larger outer structure. This inner structure was formed of smaller, swifter birds, and there were just 3 of them. The final group was actually just a single bird. This bird protected the commander to the back of this double inverted V structure. In the end, from afar, it looked as though numerous triangular formations were flying through the air. They looked no different from jets shooting through the skies, all of them exuding a 4th-dimensional aura. This sort of formation should have been far beyond Lionel's means to deal with. The only reason Aina didn't stop him wasn't because she wasn't worried, but rather because she knew that trying to stop Lionel would have been useless. He was simply too fond of doing stupid things to save people he didn't even know, let alone the fact he was now doing so to protect those he thought of as his friends. In Lionel's mind, Mordred was now a close friend of his. If Camelot fell, it would be Mordred's family that suffered the most. How could he allow such a thing to happen? At the center of these numerous smaller formations, a man wearing black robes accented by white flexible armor stood atop a predator bird of his own. Unlike the others, he was the only one on the back of this bird. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his hair shaved down until only the smallest bristles remained. The rushing winds whipped against his face, but it was as though his skin was tightly stapled to his skeleton. His stern expression never distorted, nor did his eyes ever blink. He was one of City Lord White's White Knights, Khaled Dior. Lionel stood in the skies, a simple light refraction, a ray centered around him. The more he observed the coming tide of predatory birds, the more he realized he didn't stand a chance. Even ignoring the warriors and assault weapons on their backs, just the beasts alone were beyond anything Lionel had ever seen before. They had beaks that glistened like the blades of a polished spear. Their black feathers caused the light of the setting sun to rebound as though they were metal plates. Their eyes were a bright shade of crimson that exuded a bloodthirsty light, as though all they knew was slaughter. As though this wasn't enough, Lionel felt that the large crossbows fitted to their backs contained much more power than 23rd century cannons. By his estimations, they were weaker than 25th century technology, but marginally stronger than 24th. And unlike Earth's technology, they weren't negatively influenced by force in the slightest. None of this even began to touch upon the humans that managed to command these beasts and control these machines. Lionel was simply in over his head. He was still within the 3rd dimension, and he was just a single person facing almost 500. Any smart person would turn tail and run. Lionel took several deep breaths, trying to calm his beating heart. For a moment he closed off his senses. He heard nothing, saw nothing, felt nothing. Earth was probably in chaos at this moment. Lionel could almost feel it. Everyone's lives had already been turned upside down once, but here it was again. But he was lucky. He had talent. If he wanted to and had the time, he could gain the strength to protect himself, but not everyone could claim this. Did Lionel feel some sort of responsibility because of this? He would be lying if he said no. But somewhere inside he felt it was more than this. It was the same feeling he got on the football field, the same feeling he felt when he sat down at an exam, the same feeling he had when he stepped onto his first battlefield. Lionel opened his eyes, a mad grin spreading across his face as his irises flickered a wild violet red. Lionel flipped his palm, causing a familiar black rhino's horn to appear. He brought it slowly to his lips, his blood boiling and his skin flushing crimson as bronze runes danced across it. That's a nice formation you have there. Would be a shame if someone ruined it. These birds might seem mighty and menacing, but these were exactly the kind of beasts most susceptible to outside influences. Seeing such odds before him only made Lionel want to win even more. It was exactly then Lionel blew on the horn with all his might, pouring his spirit pressure into it. The people of Terrain had pissed him off many times already. Lionel even believed that the so-called fugitives they had bribed Shield Cross stars into looking for were those who wanted to blow the whistle on this maddening plan of theirs. Unfortunately, before those fugitives could do much of anything, Earth's evolution was accelerated, causing them to enter the fourth dimension before anyone predicted. Lionel remembered how he had been treated just because he was weak. He remembered how Jirak refused to tell him what they were hiding even after he spared his life. He saw the way they tried to humiliate Aina, his Aina. Since they wanted war, he would give it to them. Chapter 446. The blaring sound of a horn tore across the skies. The perfect formation of predator birds was instantly shaken. Their riders, which had spent years learning how to tame these wild beasts, were suddenly at a loss. It felt as though they were riding bucking bulls. White Knight Dior's gaze sharpened. Despite the wild reaction of his predatory bird was equally as wild. His feet remained attached as though they had been sewn together. This noise. Khalid locked onto a particular direction. Even though his eyes saw nothing in that spot, he trusted his senses. There was most definitely an enemy right there. Lionel felt the White Knight's aura lock onto him. The feeling was like being gripped by the hands of death. He knew from the very beginning that light refraction wasn't infallible. But it only made it worse now that he was funneling the abilities of this horn right toward the flock of birds. Even if the sight of him didn't give him away, the direction in which the blaring horn was coming from most definitely did. But Lionel didn't stop blowing. From behind his light refraction spell, he locked eyes with Khalid, his blood boiling. The White Knight stomped down hard on his predator bird, sending a violent shock through its body and waking it up. By now, the perfect formation had devolved into a wild flock of birds flying in every which direction. In fact, out of their control, many on the backs of these predator birds fell from their backs. Without a choice, they pulled out an inconspicuous short pole from their harnesses. With a few clicks, they became gliders. Watching so many fall from the skies, Lionel sighed a breath of relief, thinking they would have no choice but to return to White City. But to his astonishment, as though they were assigned a life and death mission, these gliders continued forward toward their original destinations, not gazing back toward White City even once. Lionel's heart froze over. This was the first time he truly felt the resolve of these warriors. Damn it! Lionel put his horn away and pulled out his black bow and slipped on his bowman gloves. It was a palpable pressure. It was the kind Lionel hadn't felt before. In all his life, he had never faced such dauntless, fearless warriors. The demons loved war, but they still feared death. They still stormed the battlefields, but they weren't a single unit, forged together by blood and sweat. These warriors were different, though. It was impossible for them to have guessed that someone would be able to disrupt their plan before it even truly began. Yet they reacted as though it didn't matter. Despite the fact they hadn't sensed Lionel's location like their captain had, they still traveled toward him dauntlessly, not a single one of them cowering in fear. Lionel felt like he was back on those French battlefields, facing those mortal men who threw their life away to protect their country in the face of an enemy they knew was impossible to defeat. It was on that battlefield Lionel gained respect for bravery and death. Lionel knocked his first arrow, his aura surging. Little Black Star. The little mink popped into existence out of a spinning black vortex, landing atop Lionel's head as though he had never left. Lionel's body was coated in a thin film of dancing shadows, his goldish bronze hair dancing wildly beneath his towering force. Crackling lightning, sharpening winds, dancing shadows that sounded like blades gliding across his arrow. Lionel took a deep breath and released his fingers on his exhale. As though his bow was a living entity extending from his own body, it followed his will, drawing a line from his eyes to his target. PCHU. Without ability to dodge, the first glider was pierced through the skull, but the others continued flying forward as though they hadn't sensed a thing. Lionel brought out a second arrow and fired again. Then a third. Then a fourth. In the blink of an eye, he had already sent out over a dozen arrows and reaped a dozen lives. However, he could see it all clearly. His senses were impossibly sharp. How could he miss it? Not a single one who lived flinched. Not a single one thought of turning back. Not a single one cowered. There were simply too many. There had only been around 500 predator birds, but each had 2 riders, making the gliders in the sky total over 1,000. Against a normal army, killing so many without giving them ability to retaliate would have caused them to stagger and run. But this army didn't seem to function by normal standards. And how could they? This wasn't a land they had come to conquer for mere wealth. This was about their lives, their future. To their backs wasn't a mere city. It was one filled with their family, their friends, those they had to protect. This wasn't a normal invading army, and the white troops of White City weren't a normal group of men and women. Lionel clenched his jaw. These were all fourth-dimensional warriors. The only reason he could kill them was because in their current positions, they had no ability to fight back. But if he didn't put all of his strength into one arrow, he knew it would still be impossible to kill them even in this situation. He simply didn't have any large area of effect spells he could use to deal with them all at once. And even if he did, he wouldn't have enough spirit pressure to easily affect such a large area without all but killing himself. As though the situation wasn't bad enough already, it only got worse in the next instant. White Knight Dior had locked onto Lionel's general location long ago. Yet, despite knowing his men were dying one after another, he still hadn't made a move against Lionel. And the reason for this soon became clear. Quell your rage. A booming voice shocked the wild flock of predator birds. Lionel's heart trembled. The birds. It seemed that White Knight Dior wasn't designated as the head of this aerial squad without reason. The disordered, wild flock of predator birds suddenly regained their purpose, their crimson eyes all locking onto a certain direction. Lionel's blood ran cold. Chapter 447. The feeling of hundreds locking onto you, each without any other express goal than to taste your blood and reap your life. It was something Lionel had experienced before within the Merlin trials. But there was something different about facing so many beasts. They didn't have a semblance of humanity, not an ounce of reason. There were no words he could use to get them to pause, nor were there any looming timers or rules he could use to pull himself out of this situation. It couldn't have been a more primal sense of fight or flight. It was either he defeated all of these enemies or escaped them, if not, he would die. Lionel suddenly felt a wave of interference play against his light refraction spell, distorting it. In the blink of an eye, it became a useless decoy hanging in the skies, exposing him to the senses of thousands. A shudder ran through Lionel's spine. This hadn't happened because he was careless or even because he had run out of energy. This was an ability. The birds. All this time Lionel had had the thought of being careful at the back of his mind. Though it was somewhat more difficult for a unit of warriors to use their abilities as freely in such a structure where the power of the whole was more important than the individual, Lionel knew that unexpected abilities were one of the things he had to pay attention to the most. In this aspect, Lionel was perfectly correct. The actions of White Knight Dior proved as much without a shadow of a doubt. What Lionel didn't expect, however, was for the abilities of the predator birds to be maybe even more important. All this time, Lionel had been so focused on their menacing exteriors that he never considered the fact their internal abilities were what truly should have struck fear in him. Lionel rapidly retreated, placing his body almost parallel to the ground as his jet black surfboard sent him soaring backward. He quickly pulled out the dictionary, using the base of the surfboard to hide his actions. Those birds, what are they and what are their abilities? Ping. Replying to Seed, these birds are a subspecies of specially bred decoder beasts known as the jagged beak predator ravens. They are known for two main abilities, one related to their oddly shaped beaks, and the second related to their pupils. Jagged beak. Ability to disrupt force organization. Predator pupils. Ability to disrupt force organization. Lionel's heart trembled. The drawing of force arts was a delicate operation. Every force art type was a different language that spoke in a different way. But in order to convey a certain message, it had to be exceptionally particular. This much was proved by when Lionel modified Camelot's force art in order to draw them faster. Doing just this small action caused the strength of these force arts to plummet. This was all to say something very simple. If these predator ravens could disrupt the organization of force arts, then spells were all but useless against them. Lionel now understood why it was that these birds were sent as the centerpiece of the first attack. Any large-scale formations Camelot wanted to put up to protect themselves would be absolutely useless before them. Even though the predator pupils were weaker than their jagged beaks in formation breaking, when 500 of them stared at a single point, what chance did a formation stand? And beyond that, what if they began attacking that already weakened point with their beaks? Kwa-ah. Kwa-ah. Lionel's expression changed. His internal sight swept out, only to find that the distance between him and the flock of predator ravens had already halved. Their speed was inconceivable, and clearly far beyond what his surfboard could muster. Maybe if it wasn't for the heavy crossbows still strapped to their backs, they would be even faster. Lionel locked eyes with the commander in the midst. He still stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back and his black robes fluttering wildly beneath the speed of his predator raven. In truth, White Knight Dior was inwardly surprised despite his indifferent expression. For one, he recognized Lionel. They would be foolish to not know of the talents of Earth before coming to invade them, but even beyond that, even if it wasn't about invading Earth, he would have heard of Lionel. After all, the rumors of him joining Valiant Heart Mountain without having to pass the trials had already spread like wildfire. But this was only a secondary reasoning. What shocked him the most was that despite 500 predator ravens locking onto Lionel at once, all they managed to do was distort Lionel's spell. Had it not been for Lionel dispelling the mage art himself, Khalid might still be looking toward a distorted image of Lionel. The White Knight narrowed his eyes. This was good. Now that Earth had evolved into a fourth-dimensional world, those who were born within it should be experiencing an evolutionary growing phase right now. Within the next few weeks to months, many of Earth's greatest talents would experience explosive growth in their abilities. This was why it was so important for them to be swift in their approach. This wasn't only about keeping the element of surprise, but it was also about ensuring that Earth didn't get any more chances to grow. Earth didn't have the foundation of cultivation. All they could rely on was technology and their gifted abilities. The evolution to the fourth dimension would already guarantee the near uselessness of technology, so they only had the latter to worry about. With a talent like Lionel before him, how could Khalid possibly allow him to live? Lionel was most definitely one of the greatest roadblocks standing between them and claiming this world for themselves. How fair was it for Earth to have so much potential, and for terrain to have reached the end of its own? How fair was it for them to have to scratch and claw for everything while the people of Earth could be gifted the world? How fair was it for them to have to deal with people of their own world that would rather be the dogs of others rather than forging something for themselves? The truth was that there was no fairness in the world. Since that was the case, they would snatch what should be theirs themselves. And in White Knight Dior's mind, killing Lionel was the first step. Swarm him to death. Chapter 448. Lionel's feet shifted, slowing his black surfboard to a grinding halt. He pulled out the horn once again, but Khalid only sneered. Seeing his reaction, Lionel put the horn away without even blowing on it. Now that he understood the situation he was in, his mind flowed like water, jumping from idea to idea without pause or rest. It was already impossible for him to stop the gliders, but he had at least bought the baronies and Camelot time. By now, Information about what was happening here should have long since been disseminated. A city falling from the sky was not something that could be missed, and Lionel had made certain of that. Lionel's goal had already changed. Assuming that he would be able to stop an entire army by himself had been foolish. Since he knew that he couldn't, he would focus on what he could do. His first priority was to survive. His second priority would be to kill this commander. Though Lionel set this second priority, he didn't spend any of his time hoping for it. He could sense that this commander was much stronger than he was. At his current level, Lionel couldn't even deal with the likes of Jolnia and those heirs of powers with any sort of assurance. At most, he could deal with exceptionally weak fourth-dimensional existences, and those who couldn't defend themselves like those gliders. But against someone like White Knight Dior, well, it was safe to say that if this battle was happening on the ground and not the air where Khaled could not directly track down and kill Lionel himself, Lionel would likely already be dead. Lionel's emotions seemed to vanish, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto the flock of birds around him, as though he could no longer sense the gliders flying by below him. His mind reached an unprecedented sense of calm and seriousness that made the White Knight frown for the first time since this battle began. Lionel stood absolutely still in the air. Using his flying treasure as his base, he knocked another arrow, his breathing calm and steady. The way his eyes locked onto White Knight Dior made the latter feel as though there was nothing else around them, as though in this world there were only the two of them, as though if he made the slightest mistake, miscalculated just the smallest bit, that his life would be over. A halo of bronze appeared above Lionel's head, wafting out a majestic violet fog. It seemed to coat Lionel in the air of a king, even causing the atmosphere to become several times heavier. In the past, the gravity field ability of Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor had been exceptionally weak, barely increasing the gravity by a few percentage points, if that. But after absorbing so much herb essence, just the presence of Lionel's halo alone increased it by 20%, giving a 1.2x effect at no expense to Lionel's own stamina. This might not seem like much, but aerial beasts were especially reliant on their light weight. Small changes could cost them a drastic amount of speed. And at this moment, Lionel would take whatever advantage he could get. Shoo! A predator raven swooped down at Lionel, its eyes a furious shade of crimson. But almost in the exact instant it reached the range in order to do this, Lionel had reacted first, letting loose an arrow. Kwawa! Kwawa! An arc of blood sprayed from the predator raven's eyes. It sprawled in the air, its wings flapping about so wildly that it lost several feathers in a matter of moments. Lionel's surfboard moved at his command. He seemed to move in a straight line, but the angles he took were just out of reach of several predator ravens. Without any long-ranged attacks, these ravens could only assault Lionel with their beaks and their claws. Their pupils were also useless if Lionel wasn't casting any spells. Though they could disrupt the organization of force, that was all. They couldn't dispel force or negate it. This meant that against force arts, their abilities were exceptional. But against normal force attacks like Lionel's reinforced arrows, the amount of change they could cause was next to zero. To make matters worse for the flock of predator ravens, their size was simply too big. With only short-ranged attacks available to them, and even the smallest of them having a wingspan of 5 meters, nimble movements were most definitely not their forte. In fact, even if it was, with how many of them had swarmed Lionel, sudden bursts of movement would cause more problems to themselves than they would to Lionel himself. Khaled narrowed his eyes. He thought that since he was facing a child, all he had to do was intimidate Lionel into making a stupid mistake with the use of his overwhelming numbers. He thought that Lionel wouldn't have the presence of mind to realize that he was keeping the predator ravens spaced out, so that they wouldn't collide with one another. Yet, not only had Lionel realized this, he realized it immediately, and even boldly acted upon it, even to the point of allowing the flock of ravens to surround him. If things kept going like this, without the room to even turn around, they would end up flying by Lionel, and ironically letting him escape. But Khaled wasn't a fool. In fact, he was one of City Lord White's most trusted white knights. If not for this, how could he be allowed to man one of their most important missions? Disperse! He commanded calmly. In one swift motion, The predator ravens that had already passed Lionel by flapped their wings and spread out. Instantly, they had formed a large encirclement of Lionel, effectively cutting off the surrounding 500-meter space for their battlefield. Those ravens that were still surging toward Lionel spread their wings out wide, coming to grinding halts as they either shot up or down. Despite feeling that he could kill Lionel with a single strike if he got the opportunity, Khaled remained calm, retreating as well. In the center of it all that was left were a group of 3 predator ravens, the smallest and swiftest of them all, assaulting Lionel from all sides. Khaled's response immediately cured all of his formation's weaknesses. He had expected Lionel's calm expression to crack, but to his surprise, there wasn't even the slightest shift. From start to finish, Lionel had only shot a single arrow. The rest of the time, he spent calculating the safest lines of trajectory he would take to dodge around these beasts. Well, that was at least what it seemed like. But Lionel's real target had been his target from the very beginning. A particular bird beast that now had just a single eye, and was in much too much pain to follow Khaled's orders perfectly. Chapter 449. Khaled's expression changed. He had already commanded that predator raven to man the perimeter, but it hadn't listened. No, it's not that it wasn't listening, something's making it not listen. This boy. Lionel had realized long ago that Khaled's commands could be interrupted. For Khaled to have been sent to command this aerial assault, it was likely that other than gaining City Lord White's trust, it was also due to his ability. By virtue of this, it was easy to extrapolate that Khaled had likely been the one in command of the predator birds from the very beginning. After Lionel realized this, he already had all the information he needed. The fact that his horn could disrupt Khaled's control, even for a moment, meant that it was very much possible for external sources to do so. So the simple question was, what about pain? This much was easily confirmed. Though it was just for a moment, the predator raven completely disregarded Khaled's commands, almost completely disrupting the formation with its erratic flight in those moments just after Lionel pierced its eye. Though Khaled managed to regain control of the predator raven, there was one thing he didn't notice. Or rather, 2 things packaged into one. The first thing was that Lionel had hidden a secondary damage spell within an arrow. And the second thing was that Lionel had hidden a smaller version of the force arts drawn onto his horn as well. The instant he realized that his hypothesis was correct, he activated the secondary damage spell, causing the raven a surge of pain once again. And right afterward, he activated the beast-taming force arts to disrupt Khaled's second attempts at controlling the raven. When Lionel's light refraction spell was influenced, he realized a few things. For one, the influence of a single raven's pupils were exceptionally weak on him. If it wasn't for 500 disrupting his spell at once, it would have never distorted in the first place. And second, when he used his surfboard to block the view of Khaled while he pulled out the dictionary, he realized that the effect the ravens had on him were much weaker in that instant. That obviously meant that their abilities weren't area of effect, but rather truly reliant on their sight. At the very least, they had to have a line of sight to the force art they wanted to disrupt. This made Lionel realize his second very important thing. These damned birds couldn't disrupt a force art that had already been shielded and definitely couldn't disrupt one too small for them to lock eyes on. At this point, though Khaled was startled, he still didn't understand what Lionel's plan was. He could tell that something was interrupting his control, and that this thing was most definitely the arrow still lodged in the raven's eye. But what was the purpose? There were over 500 jagged-beaked predator ravens, all of which had long since surrounded Lionel, and were waiting to taste his blood. What good was there to mess with just a single one? But Khaled's expression changed again when Lionel abruptly changed directions to, seemingly by coincidence, cross paths with the erratically flying bird. With a flip of his palm, Lionel's bow disappeared, only to be replaced by a pitch-black spear. Clang! 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 Chain domain. The predator raven was suddenly tightly bound in the sky, its wings pinned to body and its claws pressed flush against itself. Veins popped out across Lionel's forehead, but he didn't retreat. His back flexed as the predator raven hung in the air beneath his might. He could see its enraged eyes trying to bore into his soul. One was a blood red while the other dripped with crimson, its precious life dripping to the ground far beneath them. However, when it saw Lionel's cold, calculating eyes looking back toward it, the bird felt fear for the first time in maybe its life. It suddenly stopped struggling, its blood running cold. In a lot of ways, beasts were just more of what humans were innately but tried to hide. Their sense of strict hierarchy was even more damning, even more rigorous, even more demanding. When facing a being superior to you, beasts lowered their heads, even if it meant certain death. Lionel's spear shot into the predator raven's eye, an undeniable callousness in his gaze as he felt his blade run deep into its skull and through its brain. Spear force burst out, mincing the insides of the predator raven in an instant. But it was what happened next that made Khaled's heart truly seize. Lionel pulled out his spear, blood spraying through the air as he thrust forth once more. But this time, his target wasn't the dead raven but rather the crossbow machine strapped to its back. The strap was severed in a single strike, separating out from the predator ravens. Lionel's chain domain released the beast but latched onto the crossbow, causing it float before him in menacing fashion. Just like that, in what felt like the blink of an eye, the entire situation had shifted. All around, there were hundreds of predator ravens, each outfitted with a crossbow, but not a single one with the capability of firing one. And then there was Lionel. He was just one man, but he had suddenly become the center of the battlefield. His gaze still cool, suffused with indifference, he used his chain domain to load the first bolt, his eyes locking onto Khaled once more. A wave of danger seized the heart of the White Knight. Before, he felt his movements were clever. Clearing out the predator ravens to surround and suffocate Lionel seemed to have been the perfect move at the time. But now, he felt as though he had co-signed his own death. The irony of it was that as a commander, he didn't even have a crossbow of his own. The indifference in Lionel's gaze was almost beginning to drive Khaled mad. There was no sense of achievement or victory, or even complacency or happiness in his eyes. It was as though what hovered before him wasn't a human, but rather a series of data points to be callously observed. And then, Lionel released the bolt. Shoo! Bang! The sound barrier shattered in an instant. It happened so quickly that by the time it was registered, Khaled was already trying to dodge out of the way. But unfortunately for the White Knight, Lionel's target was never him. KWWAA, it was a devastating sight. The cry of the raven hardly sounded before its head imploded into fleshly bits of crimson gore. The bolt was so powerful that it continued without losing momentum, piercing through the heart of another raven several hundred meters behind the first, and causing it to implode as well. White Knight Dior found himself falling through the skies, a half-stunned expression on his face. He lost. Lionel looked on from up above, his gaze locking onto Khaled's falling figure as his chain domain adjusted the aim of the crossbow toward the White Knight. Today, he would send a resounding message to the people of Terrain. Chapter 450. Khaled felt his heart seize. Something told him that no matter what he did, it would be impossible to dodge out of the way of this strike. The White Knight roared at the top of his lungs, unleashing all the force he had. There was simply no point in keeping anything in reserve. What good was reserve strength if he was dead? He didn't bother to pull out his glider. At this moment, he didn't want anything slowing his descent toward the ground. In fact, the faster he hit the ground, the better. As for whether he could survive such an impact, he would deal with just a single problem at a time. Bang! The sound barrier shattered. Roaring winds shot in every direction, clearing out a path for the released bolt. It felt for a moment as though it was cleaving the clouds with a single sword strike. Khaled flipped a palm, causing a spear to appear. He poured all of his force into it, striking out with all the might he could muster as he fell from the skies. At the same time, he kicked hard at the air, flipping himself upside down to careen toward the ground even faster. He hoped that the fact he was falling in the same direction as the bolt along with the fact he was putting his all into stopping it would dampen the strength somewhat. But reality was cruel. Though he was correct in his assessment, the diminishment in strength was practically negligible. Khaled's spear point met the bolt, his eyes practically bulging out of their sockets under his strain. In that moment, he could swear that he had never put so much strength into a strike before. But His spear point splintered apart like dried weed. The bolt continued forward as though cutting through air, blasting a bloody hole so large in his shoulder that it took his arm along with it. White Knight Dior paled. His arm spun aimlessly in the air, sparkling droplets of crimson dancing around it. It looked as if a cannonball had taken a quarter of his body with it, trying its very best to reap his life. In that moment, his spinning arm was sheared apart by the harsh winds left trailing the bolt. Had it not been for the force Khaled had protecting his body, his head might have suffered the same force. Lionel coldly looked on from above, knocking another bolt. His senses swept over it all. It seemed that every crossbow had only been outfitted with 3 bolts. But judging by their strength, Lionel understood why. With such devastating power, it was unlikely for any formation to survive the combination of the Predator Raven's abilities and this crossbow assault. In addition, weight was a huge issue when it came to such an aerial assault, and each one of these bolts rivaled even the crossbow itself in heft. But just one more bolt was fine. Since Khaled had given him such an opening, Lionel didn't believe he wouldn't be able to kill him. Lionel coldly aimed for the last time, watching the White Knight's falling figure. At that moment, several of the Predator Ravens had swarmed once again, trying to obstruct Lionel's sight toward their commander. But Lionel didn't flinch. If Khaled thought that he would lose sight because of this, he was sorely mistaken. From start to finish, Lionel's internal sight had been completely locked onto Khaled. Beyond this, would the bolt really be stopped by just a few bodies considering its strength? Lionel's chest expanded with an even breath. As though he was sinking with the crossbow, he released the moment he began to exhale, his calm breathing contrasting with the shattering boom of the bolt's speed. Qua. The bolt instantly tore through 3 raven bodies in the blink of an eye, showering the skies in crimson. Panic gripped Khaled's heart. He continuously kicked the air, trying to quicken his descent. Every time he did, he left concentric circles in the sky, accelerating himself downward with each attempt. But the bolt was simply too fast. He realized at that point that obstructing Lionel's vision had been useless. In fact, using so many ravens to block him only gave him easy access to more bolts. A strong feeling of helplessness gripped at Khaled's heart, but his expression remained the same as all others who had died to Lionel's hand on this day. He looked up toward his murderer, his gaze locking onto Lionel's. All he received in return was a plain stare, the same one that told him he was nothing but a data point, the same one that didn't seem to care for who he was as a person. Shoo! Bang! There was no sound when the bolt shot through Khaled's chest. In fact, it seemed as though the bolt had only flown through another patch of air. Rather, the huge crashing sound came from the bolt colliding with the ground and leaving a crater that rivaled the impact of a small meteor. For a moment, there was only a bloody hole, and in the next, Khaled's body imploded, shattering from the inside out into a rain of blood and gore. Having realized he made another mistake by calling the ravens to come and protect him, Khaled didn't bother to protect himself in the end, opting to simply stare at the man who ended his life. It was the kind of look only a man dauntless of death could form in his final moments. Maybe, from the very beginning, Khaled's anxiousness, his panic, his trembling, never had anything to do with the danger his life was in, and everything to do with his unwillingness to fail the mission he was given. Lionel took a deep breath before releasing the crossbow in his chain domain and gasping for breath. He coughed several times, his lungs screaming beneath the strain. Yip! Yip! Lionel's chest heaved as he tried to give the little mink a reassuring smile. Calculating the trajectory of such a fast bolt hadn't been a problem for Lionel. Others couldn't guarantee such accuracy and could only use these crossbows as siege weapons, but Lionel was different. This was all to say that the reason for his fatigue wasn't this, but rather his use of his chain domain. But it couldn't be helped, his surfboard couldn't fit such a large, heavy crossbow onto it. Lionel shook his head, turning his gaze toward where the gliders had disappeared to. By now they were definitely closing in on the first barony. Even without the Predator Ravens, that city didn't stand a chance against so many fourth-dimensional existences. Damn it. Chapter 451. Lionel was just one person. Before he even battled White Knight Dior, He had already tired his mind using so many wind spells. After this battle, he was even more spent. Lionel finally steadied his breathing and looked around at what was left of the predator ravens. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't have an easy method of controlling these beasts. His horn was designed for third-dimensional beasts. But even then, he couldn't precisely control those third-dimensional beasts. He could only rile them up into a frenzy and give them simple commands like pointing out a target to trample and targets to avoid, like he had done in his final battle on Camelot. This time, what Lionel had done was even simpler. He poured his dream force into the horn in order to influence these massive predator birds. Essentially, he forced them into temporary madness. And this was the extent of his abilities. Plus, even if Lionel could make use of these birds, he wouldn't dare to. Believing that White City only had a single method of controlling these ravens would be absolutely foolish. If Lionel brought these birds into battle, and they were suddenly turned against him, that would be the worst kind of mistake. Such a thing could completely turn the tide of battle. That said, Lionel also couldn't allow White City to so easily gain back these beasts for nothing. Lionel was absolutely certain that the loss of 500 of these predator ravens would sting for them. But how could he easily get rid of them? Lionel's eyes flashed. Little Black Star. Yip. Yip. The little mink launched himself off of Lionel's head, diving down and through the skies. It quickly came back with a shadow ball it eagerly swallowed from the top of Lionel's head. Lionel nodded. Though he had to dispel Little Black Star's sharpening ability, which had come in very useful several times already, he had no choice but to make a sacrifice in this matter. Command them to battle to the death, Lionel said. Yip. Yip. Lionel didn't have the heart to monitor such a scene, so he allowed the little mink to oversee it as he descended from the skies. By now, Aina had dug up several dozen knights, most of whom were heavily injured and unconscious. Lionel frowned because he didn't see Lancelot among them. It can't be that Lancelot really died, right? In the beginning, Lionel had been paying attention so that he could direct Aina. But after a while, he had to completely focus on the battle, so he sent all the locations at once and focused his everything on Khaled. Aina raised her brows when Lionel appeared. You're fine? Did you ever doubt it? Lionel asked with a grin. Seeing that Lionel was in the mood to lighten the atmosphere, Aina felt a weight on her chest lower. Her senses weren't as powerful as Lionel's. So through the dust cloud, she couldn't really see or feel what Lionel was facing. She felt somewhat better knowing that it couldn't have been too dangerous then. Of course, had she known the truth, let alone feeling relief now, she wouldn't have even allowed Lionel to go. But as the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. Seemingly realizing Aina's line of thinking, Lionel frowned. What happened to your sense-boosting treasure? Lionel remembered that Aina had used one of her quasi-bronze rewards from the Joan Zone on a headpiece that covered her one weakness. But ever since they reunited, Lionel hadn't seen it again. Even to the current Lionel, a quasi-bronze treasure was a big deal. Currently, he only had one broken one he had yet to repair, while the second was his force-crafting quill. Losing such a treasure was definitely a big deal. That. Aina hesitated. She seemed to flash back to memories she didn't quite want to remember. Lionel's frown deepened when he saw Aina's reaction. Just what happened to her on terrain, exactly? It seemed as though every time he got close to touching upon it, she would pull back. Lionel never pressed Aina to tell him anything, especially when it was related to her family. But he didn't have any reason to believe that this was related to the Brazinger family, and he was serious about the words he had spoken to her before. He wanted Aina to lean and rely on him. But if she never opened up to him, such a thing would be impossible. Though Lionel had taken Mordred's advice and stopped being a pansy, if he was always the only one pushing, even he could grow tired of such a thing. I lost it to an invalid. Lionel's eyes widened. What? Lionel panicked slightly, taking a step toward Aina as though he wanted to check if she was injured anywhere. It was completely irrational considering this must have happened months ago, but he couldn't help himself. The invalid Aina must be referring to was most definitely from terrain. Any invalid that had lasted so long on an old world was powerful beyond Lionel's imagining. One had to remember that invalids were only born from those who failed to awaken their abilities. They couldn't be birthed from those who succeeded, nor could they reproduce amongst themselves. This meant that the same population of invalids a world produced in the very beginning would be the very same population of invalids they had until the day the world died, or all the invalids were eliminated. There were very few exceptionally rare exceptions to this rule. Any instances that could break this rule would be cherished by invalids all over. Though terrain was weak, it was still a world with hundreds of years of history within the fourth dimension. This meant that any invalid Aina ran into was definitely at least that old. And at such an age, the likelihood that they'd be a variant invalid shot through the roof. Lionel held onto Aina's shoulders, his heart beating even more wildly than when he had been battling a white knight far beyond him in strength. He truly felt like he had almost lost Aina forever. Just what happened exactly? Chapter 452. Seeing Lionel's reaction. Aina didn't know how to react herself for a long while. The level of worry in his gaze, even for something that had long since passed, left her feeling at a loss. It wasn't a big deal. I'm here, aren't I? Lionel frowned at this response. He could sense Aina pulling away. Such a scene made him sigh and release his grip on her. Where is Lancelot? Did you not find him? Lionel changed the topic, but this left Aina at even more of a loss. Forcing things and reaching the end goal as quickly as possible always seemed like the path with the most satisfaction. A slow, long grind wasn't something most people wanted to deal with, and it was even something that scared most away. Though Lionel had spoken so many heartfelt words to Aina, they were ultimately words he had spoken himself. They weren't words that Aina had said, nor were they necessarily the way she herself felt. Whether she did or not wasn't something Lionel knew, nor was it quite the point regardless of what the truth was. What truly mattered was that even if she did, she wasn't at a point where she was ready to say them. This wasn't necessarily the end of the world. The pursuit of Aina had always been a one-person affair. Lionel never took Aina's standoffishness to heart because in his mind, it was his task to get her to warm up to him. If he failed, then it was because he was inadequate, it wasn't her fault. But this very same logical mind of Lionel's also understood that relationships weren't supposed to work in this way. As logical as he was, he also had exceptionally high emotional intelligence. He felt that his and Aina's relationship had taken a step forward she very clearly wasn't ready for. When things reached such a point, dragging her along would do more harm than good. However, this abrupt change in Lionel from overly caring to, as though he had flipped a switch, strictly business. It left Aina not knowing how to face him. Maybe for the first time, she realized just how true Lionel's words from before were. He didn't lie to her, there was no hidden truth she had to uncover. He laid out the way his mind worked and the kind of person he was right before her. Lionel might have been kind and caring, but it was all built upon a foundation of cold calculation. What drove him first and foremost was logic. Since he decided Aina wasn't ready to truly treat him as her boyfriend, he took a step back with ease, almost too much ease. Watching it all play out exactly how Lionel described left Aina feeling somewhat cold. She realized that if there really came a day where she didn't trust him, where she didn't lean on him as he would lean on her, he really wouldn't come to save her. Aina's lips trembled, but she clenched her jaw and swallowed hard, forcing back the emotions she was feeling, and not allowing her tears to fall. Her small reactions were missed by Lionel, who had started to analyze the fallen knights, calculating if he could spare the stamina to heal them, and by how much he would be able to do so. While I was digging up the others, Lancelot managed to climb back up himself. He gathered the ones who could still fight and rushed off to the Lynn barony. If it wasn't ruined, they plan on taking a shortcut to the backside of the barony and hopefully help fortify their defenses. Lionel raised his brows when he heard these words, looking back toward Aina. By now, she had already gone back to normal as though nothing had happened. They have a chance to make it before the gliders get there. Though the gliders had a head start and were flying through the skies, because they were gliding rather than truly flying, their speed was obviously lacking. Lionel doubted that the loss of their commander would slow them by much. Such organized armies definitely had a clear line of succession. Those who were meant to step up had likely already done so. Lionel wouldn't underestimate such an army in the slightest. Did they describe the shortcut to you? Lionel asked. Aina shook her head no. Lionel could only accept this. He hadn't been too hopeful to begin with. There was no time to do such a thing. And even if there was no guarantee the explanations would have been clear enough to make use of them. Yip. Yip. At that moment, little Blackstar dove down from the skies, skipping on his little shadowy platforms to dive into Aina's arms. Lionel smiled lightly. Done. Yip. Yip. Lionel nodded. Pass me their beast crystals and crossbows, they might be useful in the future. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar vanished into Lionel's spatial ring and entered the segmented cube with ease. Sometimes Lionel wondered if the little guy had a spatial affinity rather than a dark elemental affinity, but he knew better. Though they looked quite similar in function, they were very different. Those with space elemental affinities were moving through space, whereas little Blackstar was entering and exiting the shadow world. They were functionally the same, but technically different. After transferring all the beast crystals and crossbows from his shadow world and into the lab setting, the little mink dove out and back into Aina's embrace. Lionel looked over the knights again and cast a quick grand heal, a few times. When he was sure that none of their lives were in danger, and that a few would wake up soon, he called down his jet black surfboard again. Stepping onto it, Lionel turned a light smile toward Aina and stretched out a hand. Aina was a bit stunned, but still reached out. Hang on tight, Lionel said, wrapping an arm around her waist. Aina subconsciously wrapped her arms around Lionel's back as they shot into the skies. Yip. Yip. The little mink called out in dissatisfaction, feeling squished. Without a choice, the little guy could only wiggle out and find a new location within the segmented cube. Maybe going to tease Tolliver would make it feel better. Aina, however, looked up to view of Lionel's side profile. Realizing that he wasn't paying attention to her, she lowered her head back into his chest. A single tear fell from her eyes, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was absorbed by Lionel's robes. Chapter 453. Camelot suffered a great blow on the first day. White City's assault was swift and didn't contain the slightest hint of mercy. By the time Lionel and Aina made it to the city, it was already under siege by those over 1,000 gliders. Realizing it was a lost cause, rather than trying to fight a losing battle, Lancelot focused all his efforts on retreat, evacuating as many as he could. Lionel and Aina of course spent their time helping these efforts. Though Lionel had the crossbows now, he could at most shoot a single one at a time. This was the limitation of his chain domain. Even when he wasn't in the skies, he realized that the trouble loading the crossbows was greater than he originally thought. The amount of strength it took was astronomical and beyond him. One solution to this was to rely on Aina to do this, but then came the problem of aiming. Only Lionel could make a siege weapon like those massive crossbows accurate enough to target single individuals. Even if Aina loaded the crossbows for him, he would still need to aim them. And he could obviously only aim a single one at a time due to the limitations of his chain domain. A target was always changing and shifting their position. Lionel couldn't possibly expect to aim so many crossbows at once with such a blatant weakness. And, aiming just one and firing a single bolt at a time couldn't possibly allow him to stop an army of over 1,000, especially with how dauntless they were. It was better to keep the crossbows as a trump card for the future. Lionel even thought it might be nice to spend some time modifying them to make them easier to use. With his current strength, his imprint on this war definitely wouldn't be made by his fists. If he wanted to have an impact, it would definitely have to be with his crafts. Lionel returned to Camelot to find the dark atmosphere he had originally seen had become even heavier. What no one could have possibly expected was for a new enemy to appear before they even finished dealing with the Empire. Not only was this enemy more cruel than the Empire, but they even seemed to be more powerful. Lionel and Aina were eventually led to their rooms. But who knows if Mordred got to the organizers or not, but it was once again just a singular room. Lionel swept a glance around. Though the room was just as if not more luxurious than the one Mordred had given them, it was levels lower in romantic hues. In such a situation, it felt difficult not to read more into this than one should. Rather than warm lavender, red and violet colors, It had a bland whiteness to it. And instead of a refreshing, soothing scent, the room didn't have a particular smell to it at all. The neutrality of it all hung with an odd heaviness. Well, this was the case to Aina. For Lionel, he didn't feel any particular way, as though he had already disconnected himself from it all. With a flip of his palm, the segmented cube appeared, and expanded to its 5 by 5 by 5 meter size. Despite its size, it only took up about 20% of the large room. If you want to use the cleansing waters, you can. It should be easy for you to enter, just reach out with your internal sight. I'm going to go and see if I can gather any materials from Camelot's warehouses. If I can't, I'll also speak to M to see if the Demon Empire has the things I need. Materials? Aina asked softly. Lionel nodded. I'm not very powerful now, so all I can do is make things with my hands. If there's an opportunity, I'll make a replacement for the headpiece you lost. You're a force crafter? Aina's soft voice carried a hint of surprise. Lionel grinned. How is it? I'm pretty amazing, right? Lionel's smile seemed to light up the room. Though this space already had plenty of sunlight rebounding off its white walls, it lacked the same warmth. Aina didn't move even a long while after Lionel had left. Eventually, she walked slowly to the bed, crawling onto its head and pulling her knees into her chest. A touch of redness crept onto her nose as her eyes watered. She stared off into empty space, seemingly looking at nothing and thinking of nothing. But the emotions threatening to spill over were undeniable. She squeezed her knees tighter. At first it seemed as though she was simply in an emotional state, but soon, it reached beyond that. The crackling of bones sounded in the quiet room. It took only a moment for one to realize that the bones that were breaking were Aina's own. As quickly as she broke them, she healed them, only for her to fracture them once more. In any other context, this was just training taken to an extreme. Breaking down one's body and reforming it was the simplest form of training. However, within context, it felt like something much darker, like a heavy fog hanging over a young woman's life. A person's worst enemy could often be themselves. In the beginning, it might have seemed that Lionel was the only one who needed to grow and to mature, but it was easy to forget that Aina, too, was just an 18-year-old girl. Aina grew up alone, under the welfare of the Empire, most in thanks to her 5-star professional evaluation. She was never homeless nor starving. But regardless, she was alone. She didn't meet Yuri until the later years of her middle school days, and always had trouble connecting with her or anyone for that matter. She was stuck in a quagmire of her own thoughts. Even if she wanted to connect with someone, she had no idea how to. Aina continued to stare off into blank space, her tears half fallen, but not quite, her emotions half spoken, but not quite, her heart half broken but not quite. Chapter 454. You want to enter our treasure vaults? Arthur's lip twitched as he looked toward Lionel. What kind of king would allow someone not even of their kingdom to randomly enter their vaults and choose as they please? Even if one was a loyal citizen, it might only be possible to enter once every several years to pick out one or two things. Yet, not only was Lionel asking for free rein to do as he pleased, he wasn't even a person of Camelot. Despite this, Arthur felt like he couldn't say no. Maybe aside from him and a few founding members of Camelot, Lionel had done more for the kingdom than anyone else. And beyond that, Lionel was the reason he felt happier now than he had in a very long time. He had even managed to have dinner with his daughter just last night. Of course, Arthur didn't say these things aloud. After all, he had just lost a fifth of his kingdom, and was in line to lose much more of it before all of this was over. Plus, many of his citizens were in danger. But after making his decision, he had already been ready to lose everything. So, how much of a need was there for him to care about such a loss? Yes. Lionel smiled and nodded as though it wasn't a big deal. Are you trying to extort me, kid? Exactly. PFT. King Arthur's head snapped in a particular direction. But by the time he locked eyes on his son, Leonis was already looking off into the distance as though nothing had happened. Nice weather we're having, huh? Leonis rubbed his nose, scanning the room. Unfortunately for his act, the only window in the throne room was exceptionally high up, and was angled such that it only shone a small light on the throne itself. So, how could he possibly know with any sort of detail the kind of weather they were having? King Arthur shook his head. Lioness had always been so obedient. He couldn't help but feel that Lionel was having a bad influence on his son. At this point, Lionel's smile faded somewhat, and he became more serious. Arthur, I've told him this already, but you should be aware as well. If you don't want to lose too much of your power after submitting to the Empire, what's important is to show your worth. Repelling this invasion is a great opportunity for you. Since Terrain dares to do this, they're confident. I'm certain that they've scouted out Earth and understand more about our world than even maybe we do. The Empire will definitely be in trouble, and Terrain definitely won't stop until they claim the world for themselves. The greatest variable in this war is you all, Camelot and the Demon Empire. Terrain? King Arthur raised an eyebrow. You seem to know a lot about these enemies? Not a lot, just more than most. And you believe that by opening up the vaults to you our likelihood of winning will be greater? Exponentially so. And how am I supposed to make certain that you aren't embezzling anything? Lionel blinked and smiled once more. You don't. Just take it as my worker's fee. Shameless. These are your vaults. Lionel raised his brows in surprise. Lioness smiled. Yes, this should be the greatest treasure store on Camelot. The only rival to us might be Big Sister's empire. The area was much larger than anything he expected. The vaults were located on the basement floor of the castle. And despite the size of the castle itself, it took up several floors, a whole 3 levels to be exact. The amount of space totaled up to more than a square kilometer. It was absolutely inconceivable that there would actually be enough treasure to fill it all up with. The first floor was filled with stacks of gold coins. Lionel felt as though he had walked into a dragon's den. He was certain that just the existence of this place was a huge hazard. If one of these gold piles slipped, it could easily bury someone alive. Still, Lionel wasn't very interested in these piles of gold. On Earth, gold had lost its value a long time ago. Other than being a good conductor, it wasn't very useful otherwise. It was too soft of a metal and not very good for weapons or armors. It was unfortunate for Camelot, but it seemed that in any places other than their kingdom, this first floor of treasures was quite useless. However, there were 2 more floors below this one. Lionel didn't know what to say for a long time. The store of ores seemed endless. They piled up into what seemed like perpetuity. Though most were pseudo-4th-dimensional ores, their value was so much greater than the gold on the first level that they couldn't even be properly compared. It felt like blasphemy to do so. And here Lionel thought he was somewhat of a tycoon after mining the hive, only to find out that he was still very much a poor man if he was comparing himself to a true kingdom. But this made sense. Camelot had existed as a pseudo-4th-dimensional world for a very long time. Over the years, it only made sense that they would gather so many precious ores. Even if there was nothing else, Lionel felt that he could create so much with just what was before him. He saw several mountainous piles of herb ore, countless types of vein and elemental ores. He even saw some true 4th-dimensional ores hidden within that might have slipped through the cracks. Yet there was still one more floor. As shocked as Lionel was on the second, the third floored him. He finally bowed down. He was indeed a poor man. He apologized for ever believing that he was wealthy. No matter where he looked, there were endless mountainous piles of 4th-dimensional ores. If the gold piles could have buried a normal human, these could bury even Lancelot and King Arthur. Seeing such a sight, Lionel thought that King Arthur was too stingy for even hesitating to say yes to him. Even if he wanted to take and use it all, would he even be able to? But at the same time Lionel was shocked. Just how did a pseudo-4th-dimensional world like this produce so many 4th-dimensional metals? There even seemed to be more of them than there was on the second level. How did that even make any sense? It was safe to say that any guilt Lionel would have felt taking advantage of Camelot like this flew out the window. Chapter 455. How did you gather so much? Lionel finally asked Lioness. Lioness started. This room didn't used to be so full. It got like this after the Merlin trials collapsed. Lionel's eyes widened. You mean? These used to be rewards you could spend skill points to buy. But after the trials collapsed, they were all collected up by us. Lionel was speechless. Back then, he had been mostly worried about gathering up the core of the trial world. Since he was taking it, he felt it would be too shameless to take anything else, so he only accepted the goddess necklace after Krakos brought it to him personally. But he hadn't expected that he had really missed out on so much. Now that Lionel thought about it, when he was within the trials, he had been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of items within the special store. So instead of scrolling through all of them one by one, he used his voice to filter for what he wanted to look for. In that situation, he didn't really have time to leisurely scroll through the store, so he always filtered using his voice. Due to this, he didn't have a proper understanding of the scope of items that could be found within the special store. I was too nice, Lionel thought to himself. Lionel shook his head. Most of the ores he saw here were tier 1 to 3 black-grade ores. This put them at the lower levels of the 4th dimension. But the sheer volume might very well beyond anything even the Empire had managed to gather to this point. Of course, Lionel couldn't confirm this with any sort of certainty, but he felt that he likely wasn't too far off with his assessment. My divine armor. If I can, Lionel slowly shook his head. He didn't feel he was skilled enough to complete his divine armor just yet, not to mention the fact he hadn't even decided just what kind of divine armor to build. Still, if there was ever a place to train, this would be it. And there was likely no better place for Lionel to find the resources he needed to build it. Wait. Lionel's gaze swept through the massive treasure house. At that moment, he suddenly shot forward, stunning Leonis who had been by his side. Wait for me. Leonis ran after Lionel. Leonis had unfortunately yet to reach the peak of the 3rd dimension. So he hadn't broken through like his father, mother, sister and the others. So he was obviously no match for Lionel in speed. Luckily, this storehouse was only a few hundred meters in length and width. Even though Lionel was much faster, he couldn't go very far to begin with. Leonis found Lionel amidst a pile of ores, his hand pressed flush against its side. Ah, be careful if it falls over. Lionel nodded, acknowledging Leonis' worries. If he died beneath a pile of precious ores he had just been greedily eyeing, wouldn't that be too pathetic? The pile suddenly shifted, causing Leonis' heart to seize. But Lionel didn't panic. Soon, as though by magic, the pile separated, revealing a radiant piece of Oregon. Lionel grabbed onto the ore as the rest of the pile settled down. Only then did Leonis feel his heart calm down once again. He had forgotten that Lionel was a variant earth mage. Something like this was within his abilities. But the level of control that was needed was beyond Leonis' imagining. Leonis shook his head and looked curiously at the shimmering black ore in Lionel's hands. You recognize this ore? Leonis asked, somewhat curious. Though they had brought all of these ores here, the truth was that they had yet to research most of their functions. In this aspect, they were still very much in the dark compared to others. Usually, the Merlin trials would have a short explanation of what the ore was before they chose it. But obviously with it collapsed, it couldn't provide such functionality. I recognize all the ores, Lionel said with a smile. This one is black herb ore. It's a foundational type metal used as a fusion agent in crafts. It works almost like iron in that it has a base type that can be forged into all sorts of chemical structures depending on your approach and technique. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say it was the most important ore in the entire universe. This one is special though because it was on the verge of becoming bronze herb, or before it was mined from its core. So the ore essence within it is a margin purer than regular black herb Oregon. This or might be able to help me clear a final hurdle in my metal body. Leonis' brows raised in surprise. It wasn't because of Lionel's detailed explanation, but rather because Lionel said he recognized all of these ores. Even though Leonis wasn't educated on the topic, he could easily tell that there were hundreds of types of ores in this room, each with their own unique variations. To be able to recognize them all would take an absolute expert. Lionel took a deep breath. First, I need to organize this room. There's no order to anything. Lionel always liked things to be neat and tidy. This was why his room was always meticulously kept after. though he cared less about his own appearance. It was just a quirk of his. He had the compulsion to organize these ores by type and ability. It would make what he wanted to do next much more efficient. Things may get a bit wild, Leonis. Stay close to me if you'd like to remain here. Leonis nodded and then shook his head. It's fine. I have a feeling this will take a long time. No need for me to continuously be looking over your shoulder. Leonis chuckled. If you need anything else, just let me know. There will be another council gathering soon to strategize defensive measures. We also can't be certain of the Empire's plans now and if they've changed. Lionel nodded in acknowledgement. He didn't expect everyone to base plans around him to begin with. It may very well be possible that Arthur wasn't too optimistic about him from the beginning. In the end, he was just a single third-dimensional being. How much change could he really cause? At the moment, it was very likely that all the forts and the capital were being attacked. If Lionel wanted to swing his weight around, he would need more. Lionel could already sense that there was the evolution he had been looking for so long hidden in these piles. It was just unfortunately more difficult to reach. There was no doubt that this evolution was the most important centerpiece of his divine armor, and there was just enough of it to form the 3 portions of essence he needed. Lionel's gaze sharpened as he looked around. This would be his battlefield. Chapter 456. The instant Leonis had left the range, the treasure vault became a violent storm of swirling ores. Lionel sat at the very center of it all, in silent meditation. Ores swooped inches from his body at speeds that surpassed a bullet, yet he didn't flinch. How could he? They were all in his control to begin with. If others were watching on, they would find that the disorganized store of ores was very quickly tending toward disorganized order. Then from there, it very quickly became completely tidy. Beads of sweat fell down Lionel's brow. Without a choice, he activated his bronze runes. This instantaneously made the control of the metals around him several times easier, even to the point that the speed they whizzed around the room with even accelerated. It should have been impossible for Lionel to control so many ores at once. At the very least, he shouldn't have been able to guarantee that they didn't crash into each other. After all, Lionel could split his mind more than a dozen ways, but it definitely wasn't to the point of being able to do so hundreds of ways. Rather, Lionel used a much cleverer method. He drew a map of the treasure stores in his dream world, rebuilding a 3-dimensional construct. Then he color-coded pathways for the ores to follow, ensuring that these pathways rarely, if ever, crossed. Almost as though he was playing a game, Lionel sorted these ores one after another. This way, all he had to do was focus on ensuring that the ores always stuck to these pathways, and it was not necessary for him to split his mind more than a dozen or so ways, each for a different kind of organ. Very quickly, Lionel spread out the ores, arranging them into neat rows with clean roads between them. The first division was in ore types. There was a section for foundational ores, veins ores, vessel ores, domain ores, and finally, the pile Lionel was most looking forward to, evolution ores. Foundational ores were over 70% made of herb ores. Other foundational ores simply weren't as common or as useful. They had very specific use cases that made them almost useless. And oftentimes, their functions could be accomplished by herb, or to an even better degree. So other foundational ores were only used in rare instances. The only foundational ore that made Lionel take a pause while observing it was lava rhombus organ. It had only one functional use case: the fusion of earth and fire type ores. When hearing this, one can understand why such foundational ores were looked down upon. For one, earth and fire weren't opposing elements. Herb ore could allow their fusion easily. There was simply no need for this special use case. However, Lionel, for obvious reasons, was intrigued. While herb ore could be used in every use case, it also required a high level of skill. Knowing exactly how to temper the ore to receive the desired effect was the bane of many force crafters. These unique foundation ores, however, could be used in complex constructs to make them far simpler. After separating out these 5 major categories, the rest was obviously down to the elements and other unique cases like soul-type ores. Once Lionel was finished, he looked back toward the smallest pile. Of course, this held the evolution ores. There were actually enough for 13 portions of essence. If Lionel combined this with the 7 he already had, this meant that he could form 2 complete portions of bronze evolution ore. One had to remember that 10 black evolution ores could form a bronze evolution ore, and that 100 bronze evolution ores could form a silver one. Evolution ores had 2 abilities. The first was fusing 2 ores into a unique or never-before-seen. And its second ability was to evolve an ore to the next level. A black evolution ore could evolve a 3rd-dimensional ore into the 4th, while a bronze evolution ore could evolve a 4th-dimensional ore into the 5th. According to the speculations of Lionel's father, if one formed their divine armor's core with 10 black evolution ores, it was theoretically possible to form a quasi-5th-dimensional divine armor, while still being within the 4th dimension. Lionel thought back to the quasi-bronze grade, or he had found within the hive, warping domain Oregon. If he made it the core of his divine armor, wouldn't he be able to cross that barrier and stand firmly within the 5th dimension? Even if he couldn't, the effects would be so infinitely close to the 5th dimension that nothing within the 4th dimension would be able to withstand its impact. Of course, this wouldn't be in terms of strength, but rather in terms of function. Though Lionel hadn't settled on the design of his divine armor, the one thing he knew for certain was that his warping domain, or would be the centerpiece of it all. Warping or was able to create an independent space that could make even a single step feel like an entire mile. Due to this, it was quite well known for its defensive abilities, but as Lionel learned more about domains, he felt that they were far more flexible than this. The uses of domain were as variable as the uses of an ability. It depended on a person's creativity to use it properly. Now that Lionel had this entire warehouse of ores available to him, the picture of his divine armor came into view. Rather than focusing on attack, defense, or elemental types, his plan would be very simple. He would maximize his own speed while ensuring his enemies felt as though taking even a single step was almost impossible. As Lionel looked through the various ores, he felt a picture becoming clearer and clearer in his mind. And the center of it all would be his warping domain Oregon. However, whether he would be able to accomplish the aspirations forming in his mind would depend on if he could build up the skill he needed. While he had many types of ores around him, there was just a single warping domain Oregon. Spatial type treasures were too rare, even to the point there were less than a dozen in this entire treasure store, and only 2 of which could match up to warping domain or in value. In that case, let's give this tiger wings. Lionel's gaze blazed. Maybe even Terrain could have never been aware that their greatest enemy would come in the form of a young man sitting cross-legged on the floor of a vast treasure vault. Chapter 457. Eat slowly, little Tolly, slowly now. Lionel wiped off sweat that threatened to sting his eyes once more. He never forgot that one of the hazards he learned about metal spirits was their propensity to overeat. If he let it happen, Tolliver could go mad and harm him. This was the main reason Tolliver had yet to evolve into the 4th dimension along with Blackstar. Lionel was very careful about how much he fed him, and what he fed him. Lionel preferred to give the little fella high-quality ores that would fill him very quickly. This was much better than feeding Tolliver a lot of low-quality ores. The more high-quality ores Tolliver ate, the more powerful the little guy would become in relation to its evolution stage. So Lionel took this very seriously. Oh! Tolliver suddenly shot out of Lionel's gloved hands. The little guy's body concentrated into a single point before explosively growing. Lionel realized that this was a sign that little Tolly was finally crossing into the 4th dimensional realms. Lionel's mind had already entered such a realm, so he was very confident that he would still be able to control and command Tolliver appropriately. Tolliver came back to Lionel looking just that much more lustrous. Ready to work, little guy? Bloop bloop. Lionel smiled lightly before his expression suddenly changed. He quickly commanded little Tolliver to float in the air as he scanned his black gloves. After just a moment, he smiled bitterly, watching it corrode as though having been dipped in strong acid. Lionel sighed, peeling the gloves off of his hands before it got worse. He didn't have replacement gloves. And though he felt he might be able to make them, how would he? He needed gloves to craft with little Tolliver, but couldn't make the gloves he needed to craft with Tolliver, without little Tolliver. Lionel grit his teeth. I have been avoiding this training for a long time. No time better than the present. One of the last lessons of his father's beginner's guide was to begin to stray away from gloves. The stronger a metal spirit became, the more elaborate a force crafter's gloves became. Eventually, they would become a hindrance to hand speed and coordination. Honestly, Lionel thought his dad was a madman. As if calling himself Father Overlord wasn't bad enough, the old man actually wanted to kill him. Lionel took a deep breath and activated his bronze runes once again, thinking back to the words his father had spoken. You are a Morales, the earth bows down to you, not the other way around. Gloves are for cowards. It made Lionel wonder why his father put a hazard section in the dictionary at all. First it was forming a fifth-dimensional divine armor, and now it was force crafting without protection. Lionel couldn't help but feel that his old man was simply too irresponsible. Lionel brought out the first catapult, steadying his beating heart. With a flip of his palm, a familiar chain necklace appeared in Lionel's hand. Fine cracks spread across its surface, causing a flicker of rage to appear in Lionel's heart. This chain necklace was the very first quasi-bronze treasure Lionel ever possessed. Unfortunately, due to Miles almost blowing him to smithereens, it was heavily damaged. The truth of the matter was that it should have been impossible for explosives of the 21st century like Miles used back then to damage a near fifth-dimensional treasure. The main issue is that this was an energy-based treasure. As a result, it had to rely on the force around it in order to form its defensive shields. This was exactly why it stopped working when Lionel was under the influence of the force disruption towers. Simply put, this chain necklace was using third-dimensional force to protect itself, and as a result was far weaker than it should have been. If it was using fourth-dimensional force, it would likely take at least 24th century explosives and technology to damage it to this extent. That was right. At full strength, this chain necklace could survive several blows from the crossbows that White Knight Dior couldn't survive 2 strikes of. This was the power of quasi-bronze treasures. This was their true value. It was just a shame that this chain necklace was damaged. For now, that is. This was Lionel's first test for himself. If he wanted to gain enough skill to build his divine armor, he would need to build up his skill just as quickly as he built up his strength within Brave City. The only way he could protect himself, his friends and Aina would be if he had the strength to do so. And this was his fastest path toward that end. Lionel smiled lightly. If I have my divine armor, I won't need this. In that case, I'll combine both necklaces into one. This should be a good birthday present. Lionel took out the Treading Goddess necklace. His mind spun with thoughts. He wanted to combine 3 abilities into one. First, the defensive abilities of the chain necklace, the teleportation abilities of the Treading Goddess necklace, and finally, add something on the end to give Aina a sensory boost. After half an hour of meditation, his gaze grew cold and calculating. He outstretched a hand and allowed little Tali to land in his bare palm. Lionel hadn't been wrong. Earth was in shambles, facing battles on all fronts. All 8 forts and even the capital was under siege. The only difference was that the capital was under siege by 2 cities with the moon, Camelot, and the 8 forts only being under siege by 1 each. However, surprisingly, at this moment, the Emperor of Earth sat in his garden, the delicate chirping of birds around him. He continued to meditate, raising a cup of tea to his mouth without opening his eyes. He listened intently to a report, not showing any particular reaction. That should be all, Imperial Grandfather. This is the current situation of the Camelot satellite. Emperor Fox nodded his head. You may go. Noah hesitated. Was that all his grandfather wanted to tell him? Where were the orders? Should he continue to try and assimilate Camelot and the Demon Empire? Or should he focus on wiping out White City? Grandfather. Is there something else? Emperor Fox let out a deep sigh, his eyes opening to reveal 2 piercing emerald gems. It felt as though he had the whole world within his purview. Noah, you've grown too reliant on me. Noah didn't know what to say. He stared at the talisman in his hand at a complete loss. Did you know that your cousin is on that satellite right now? Noah's expression changed. The very same White Knights you came to report to me about, he's already killed one. He didn't have an army, he didn't have support, he only had himself. Noah's heart seized. How was that possible? That. Do not contact me again until White City is nothing but flat earth. Chapter 458. Noah placed the talisman down, a small hint of shock on his face. Still, it only took him a moment for him to regain his calm. Noah didn't know what his grandfather's ability was. In fact, he was certain that no one knew. Emperor Fox was a man who always kept his cards close to his chest. Even his closest advisors might not know everything he was thinking about. But this was the way of an emperor. To remain so calm even in the face of everything you and your ancestors had built potentially burning down. This was the marker of a true ruler. That said, Noah wasn't so certain that this was all about calmness. He always got the sense that his grandfather wasn't calm but rather confident. It was a subtle difference that was hard to grasp but even harder to fake. However, as the prince of the empire, Noah knew the situation well. And quite frankly, there was simply nothing to be confident about. Earth was caught completely unprepared. This wasn't a failure of Emperor Fox and the royal family, but rather simply due to circumstances. Who could have predicted the appearance of Camelot? And who could have predicted that a second acceleration would occur right after the first? In truth, Camelot should have been a variable terrain couldn't prepare for. But due to the circumstances, it became a saving grace for them instead. What would you like to do? Jessica interrupted Noah's thoughts. Maybe only she was allowed to listen in on a conversation between the emperor and a prince. Noah tapped on the large table before him, his thoughts running wild. He wasn't very sure how he felt about his cousin. He didn't hate nor love Lionel. He was about as neutral on the topic as one could get. At the same time, he could also tell that his grandfather wasn't overly eager to bring Lionel back to the palace either. Though it was said like this wasn't to say that Emperor Fox didn't want anything to do with Lionel. If that was the case, he wouldn't praise him so much. Rather, the main point was that the emperor was content to watch Lionel spread his wings out from afar. According to the information we have, there's a great possibility that he is within Camelot at the moment. The dead white knight that His Imperial Majesty mentioned should have fallen before the attack on the First Barony. That attack occurred within 20 to 30 kilometers of Camelot. This coupled with the fact reports say that Prince Lionel was a part of the zone trial that brought Camelot here, and this is the most appropriate conclusion. Noah nodded noncommittedly. How do you think he managed it? Noah couldn't help but ask after a while. Jessica didn't respond. She had been with Noah long enough to know that whenever he asked questions he knew they didn't have enough information to answer, that he didn't really expect one. Noah was usually a meticulous, hard-nosed, and between-the-lines kind of person. The only moments he acted like this was after he finished speaking with his grandfather. He didn't even seem to have the same aura about him anymore. Noah stood, his calm returning in full. It seems that Imperial Grandfather was correct. There are many eyeing our Earth and some of them might even still be lurking in the shadows even now. Maybe it's time we show them that we aren't pushovers. Noah walked to the side of his military tent. Located on what would have been a wall, there was a weapons rack, but it was filled with nothing but sabers. However, shockingly enough, each and every one of these sabers were as large as a human body, carrying blades that seemed capable of cleaving a mountain in two. Despite their heft, Noah picked up the first with a single arm. Its radiant blue blade reflected beneath the dim flickering lights. It seemed to exude a magic aura. This one will do. With a flip of his palm, the saber vanished and Noah walked to the entrance of his tent. Jessica, all the preparations you made for the Demon Empire. Forget them for now. We have a city to level. Jessica nodded. According to their intelligence, the Demon Empire had allied with Camelot and planned to submit to the Empire. With this sudden change, their thoughts might turn from submission to thoughts of taking advantage of the Empire in their time of weakness to maintain their own sovereignty. In that case, rather than giving them a hollow show of power for mere negotiations, they'd show them a real one. Within Camelot's treasure vaults, Lionel had no idea that his grandfather was aware of his presence already. In fact, he wasn't even aware that he had a grandfather to begin with. In Lionel's mind, his only family was his father and his missing mother. But maybe even if he was aware, he wouldn't have the mind to think about it. Lionel sat on the ground, beads of sweat falling down his face. If one stopped focusing on his visage and focused on his hands, it would be possible to see a ghastly sight without compare. Blood dripped from Lionel's hands, ricocheting off the ground and echoing through the vast vault. Little Tolly happily swam around Lionel's fingers, not realizing the damage it was causing. But Lionel couldn't blame the little guy. Despite having evolved into the fourth dimension, it was still nothing but a toddler. In fact, the little guy hadn't even really begun to form cohesive thoughts of its own. Though Lionel could command Blackstar with words, little Tolly didn't accept such direction well. Lionel had to use a series of images for Tolliver to understand his meaning. However, understanding didn't make it any less painful. There was good news and bad news. The bad news was that it was almost impossible to suffer such pain and focus on crafting at the same time. How could one maintain a steady connection and complete such intricate actions when it felt like the world was collapsing around them? The good news, however, was that Lionel managed to evolve under pressure and create a new ability. He called the ability Dream Sense. Since it was so hard to feel such pain and focus at the same time, why do so at all? Dream Sense allowed Lionel to split his senses the exact same way he split his mind. It was just an extension of his Dream Clone ability. Lionel used Dream Sense to split his mind two ways. One tackled the brunt of the pain he was feeling while the second focused entirely on his crafting. It was on the third day of using this ability that Lionel evolved once more. He realized something incredibly important. If he could split his senses to help him focus, why not split his sensory pain between several minds? If he did that, wouldn't this allow him to dull his pain by several factors? If he split the same pain between 10 minds, wouldn't he reduce his own pain by a factor of 10? This realization truly opened Lionel up to a new world. If he could control his mind even down to this minute level, just what other possible abilities could his creativity have in store for him? Chapter 459. After grasping an initial mastery of Dream Sense, Lionel realized just how much freedom he had in this regard. While he could diverge his senses by separating his mind, if he instead chose to layer and concentrate his senses instead, he could cause a convergent response instead. In the end, this meant that Lionel was suddenly capable of both dulling and magnifying his senses by several times, all of which was limited by the number of dream clones he could form. On the surface, this wasn't very important, but the applications Lionel could think of were practically endless. For one, if Lionel had the ability to dull his pain in this fashion, he wouldn't have struggled nearly as much to open the ninth door of his metal synergy lineage factor. By extension, if Lionel applied his higher pain threshold to other training methods, he could force his body to withstand much more than it previously could. Though the idea of suffering through pain and tempering one's willpower sounded nice, this was something that could only appear in fantasy novels. The human body had strict limits on the pain it could withstand for a reason. Going beyond these limits often meant the shutting down of one's body regardless of how much willpower you had. Pushing past these limits was often impossible, not for lack of willpower, but simply due to lack of feasibility. At the same time, however, these thresholds were often lower than they could be. This made sense. If one's body only shut down when at the very edge of breaking down, it might no longer be possible to pull back. But like this, Lionel would be able to use his own senses to look for his bodhi's breaking point, and choose a safe point to stop before then. This ultimately gave Lionel far more control over his own body. Still, the applications of this were far beyond just dulling pain. If Lionel applied this skill to his internal sight, for example, he could make it several times more sensitive than it had been in the past. This could not only make his calculations more detailed and accurate, it would also be almost impossible for someone to slip by his senses. Applied in this way, Lionel could layer his vision to gain more details in a single look. He could layer his sense of touch to make his fingers more sensitive during force crafting. He could even layer his sense of taste to make food tastier if he so chose to. The potential applications were almost endless. When Lionel realized this, his mind seemed to implode. It wasn't with pain, but rather felt as though a door had been thrust open to him. Lionel sent all his focus into his arms, first separating his mind to control them independently, then layering them once again to multiply this same control. The instant he finished this, his finger's speed hitched for a moment before it felt as though they broke past a barrier. His movements became smoother and more fluid, his control over little Tolly reaching unprecedented heights. This is it. Superior Grade 1 designation. Lionel's hand coordination and speed had been stuck at Advanced Grade 1 designation for a long time. Thanks to his metal synergy lineage factor, he was effectively as good as someone who had already stepped into Superior Grade 1 designation, but it hadn't been a true breakthrough just yet, until just now. Looking down at his bloodied hands, orchestrating the movements of thin lines of silver like a conductor guiding a voluminous sonata, he couldn't help but laugh. This feeling, he had never expected it to feel so good. Lionel's confidence shot through the roof. He finally felt as though his body could keep up with his mind. It was almost as though his own body had become one of his familiars as well. He controlled it no differently than he took control of little Tolly and little Blackstar. The two necklaces before Lionel seemed to magically and seamlessly fuse into two. In the blink of an eye, Lionel completed a task he had spent several days on. The treading goddess necklace became more resplendent, exuding a silvery aura. Without looking to the side, Lionel locked onto a soul type ore from the vein and vessel piles. Lionel had already long since picked these two ores out. If he wanted to give this necklace a sensory boost, this was the only way. The vessel ore was known as Ghost Whispering Oregon. It had the ability to continuously absorb and purify force into soul force. It was born in places with exceptionally dark energy, and due to this ability to create soul force, it became known as the Ghost Oregon. The vein ore was known as Soul Pulsing Oregon. When fed an appropriate amount of soul force, it had the ability to amplify it. But what made it so useful was the fact it was able to resonate with whoever marked it, thus effectively become an extension of this person's own soul force. Due to this ore's sensitivity to souls and their resonance, it gave whoever fused with it an equally great sensitivity to the resonance of other souls in proportion to how much soul force it was provided with. When these two ores came together, the results were exponentially greater. By Lionel's previous estimates, it would have taken him at least a week to finish the integration of these two ores without disrupting the balance of the remainder of the treasure. After all, the more moving parts a treasure had, the more complex it was and the more difficult it was to succeed in crafting. Yet Lionel now felt a confidence he never had before. He felt as though the entire world was in his hands. The communication between one's brain and their body was a limiting factor to everyone. This was why endless training was necessary to break down the body and force it to understand the tasks the brain wanted it to complete. But for the current Lionel, at least within certain limitations, he could control his body to the finest detail on the very first try. All of his mental prowess was concentrated into his hands. As though each joint had become a node to be controlled at his whim, he took hold of his own body like it was a puppet on strings. Bend to my will. Chapter 460. Lionel's right hand moved like the wind, wrapping around the Ghost Whispering Oregon. At the same time, his left shot toward the Soul Pulsing Ore, working with complete independence. Leon's gaze stared out into blank space. It was as though his mind was completely wiped. It even felt like his eyes might roll back into their sockets at any moment. Yet the speed of his hands didn't slow in the slightest. Lionel's right hand rapidly tapped at the Ghost Whispering Oregon. Little Tolly raced across its surface, causing it to spin rapidly and heat up even faster. Smoky impurities flew into the air and dripped down from the green Oregon. It shrunk at a speed visible to the naked eye, falling from the size of a palm to the width of just a few fingernails. Lionel's left didn't stop. It stretched out at odd angles, causing little Tolly to spread across the Soul Pulsing Ore's surface. Very quickly, the red Soul Pulsing Ore became an incredibly thin length of metal wrapped the entire way by little Tolly's body. Yet, it seemed as though the thinness wasn't enough for Lionel, as he continued to elongate the metal. From an ore of barely 2 inches thick, the Soul Pulsing Ore became a thin line that stretched almost 5 meters. Finally satisfied, Lionel's left fingers twitched, causing the thin line to fold in on itself lengthwise, thus having it to just over 2 meters. To the naked eye, it seemed as though nothing had happened other than this. But any sharp force crafters would be able to see that after folding it, Lionel used the added thickness he gained to roll the thin line into a thin tube. The ore ultimately became a fragile hollow tube that seemed capable of snapping in on its own weight at any moment. But what happened next was truly magical. Little Tolly, who had wrapped itself around the thin tube at Lionel's command, suddenly began to move. At first it seemed as though the little guy was snapping the delicately constructed ore in half, but it soon became clear that this wasn't the case at all. Little Tolly began to bend and contort into an intricate shape. The more time passed, the more complex the structure became, and the smaller size it seemed to shrink to. It felt almost as though Lionel was constructing a miniature maze, hidden within the thin, gorgeous lines of the soul-pulsing Oregon. But the reality was that he was constructing something much more miraculous than that. In just an hour, the over 2-meter-long tube had been sculpted into a small spiderweb of structures with a width of no more than half an inch. From afar, it looked like an oval gem. But up close one could see that it was a maze of delicately forged lines. As though by coincidence, the tempering of Lionel's ghost whispering or concluded at the exact same time. By now, it looked like nothing more than a flowing blue liquid, having lost its green color during the purification process. Without a single pause, Lionel communicated with little Tolliver to bring the thin blue liquid forward. Then, as though he was a madman, he controlled it to pour over the delicate red structure he had just formed. One would think that with the heat difference, the red structure Lionel took so long to form was finished. The melting point of ghost whispering or was simply far higher than that of soul pulsing or there shouldn't have been even a chance for it to survive. However, little Tolly's body had yet to stop covering the delicate red structure. In two parts, Lionel both controlled little Tolly to protect the delicate maze while on another hand controlling the blue liquid to pour over it. The blue substance wormed throughout the structure, sliding through impossibly small crevices with absolute ease. If other force crafters saw Lionel now, they would be stunned to the point of speechlessness. Such a process would usually be done in several steps. The easiest method would have been to split the structure into two molds before fusing them into one at the end. However, Lionel didn't take this approach at all despite it being the far easier option. The reason for this was quite intuitive. When using two molds, it would be impossible to avoid imperfections. The only way to guarantee a sublime result would be to complete the gem in a single step. But those who had the skill to do such things were simply too few. One had to remember that most would never even reach the advanced Grade 1 designation, let alone the superior Grade 1 designation. In addition, those who could use metal spirits who were known for their ability to complete intricate crafts were even fewer. Lionel's vision regained his clarity and a sudden wave of fatigue slammed into him. His mind spun and he collapsed to the ground, the skin of his hands peeling and dripping with blood. Lionel sent a glance toward the newly reforged treading goddess necklace, a light smile creeping up on his lips. He modified it so that Aina could wear it as a headpiece again. It looked much less flashy than it did in the past, and the only exotic thing about it was the purple gem that hung from its center. But Lionel was greatly satisfied. He felt that his skill had reached a new level. Hey dictionary, scan this treasure for me. Ping treasure, unnamed. Abilities, minor teleportation. Instant teleportation within 3 meters once every 3 seconds. Has enough stores to save up for 2 charges. Force skin. At full charge, capable of withstanding 3 strikes of a pseudo-fifth-dimensional entity. Sensory boost. Increase sensitivity and range of internal sight by a factor of 3. Grade. Elite Quasi-Bronze. Lionel grinned. This should be a good birthday present, right? Other than the fact the teleportation charges had fallen from 3 to 2 from the original Treading God's necklace, everything else was perfect. Lionel still remembered those emotions that ran through him when Miles and Simeon almost killed the two of them. Back then, he had greatly regretted not giving Aina the defensive treasure he had chosen for her earlier. Her birthday is just a few weeks away, I'll give it to her then. Lionel thought with a smile. After thinking this, Lionel became serious once more. Originally, he had expected it to take him at least a month to complete Aina's present. By the time he finished, He believed he would have the skill he needed to build the crafts he had in mind. But he never expected for him to have a breakthrough and ultimately take less than a month. But this was even better. Now he could begin immediately. Though his body was tired, Lionel's mind was still sharp. He felt an endless energy coming from his dream world. He felt as long as his mind was awake, the state of his body meant little. Grand heal. Lionel was showered with blinding light elemental force, the injuries to his hands repairing at impossible speeds. Let's start. Chapter 461. A knock sounded. Lionel? Aina? Ho-ho, feel free to ignore Big Sis if it's inconvenient to. Before Mordred could finish her words, the door to the room opened. Mordred's words were caught in her throat as she blinked speechlessly. Aina stood before her with an equally questioning glance. It had already been more than a week since they came here, but this was the first time someone had come to check on Aina. Well, aside from the usual delivery of food that came every so often. Camelot wasn't clear on Aina's strength, while King Arthur believed that Lionel wasn't quite strong enough to make a big difference either. Though King Arthur had battled and lost to Lionel before, those circumstances were quite special. Back then, due to his pride, he fell into Lionel's rhythm and tried to compete with him in speed casting. Objectively speaking, back then, if Lionel had to battle either Mordred or King Arthur, it would have been a difficult and long fight even after grasping the Winter Realm with his bow. This was how much strength these two legends had. Had King Arthur been more level-headed back then, Lionel wouldn't have been able to make such a fool out of him. This much should have been clear by the fact that, despite the optics of it all, Arthur came out of their battle completely unscathed. And now, King Arthur had finally crossed the barrier he had stalled at for so many years. This wasn't all either, because now the people of Camelot were considered to be people of Earth. As the world evolved, the people of Camelot, too, began to awaken to their own abilities. This was all to say that the King Arthur of now was by far and away stronger than the version of himself Lionel would have already struggled mightily to defeat. So despite the fact that Lionel had grown since then as well, he was unlikely to last a few exchanges with the current King Arthur even now. So, it made sense that no one had come to communicate with Aina and Lionel. In their minds, what difference could these two children possibly make? The only person who knew that it was inadvisable to underestimate Lionel was Mordred, and this was because she knew everything about him. Even secrets he had never exposed to another before. But there was one interesting thing about that trial that Mordred hadn't told Lionel about. Back then, the first part of the trial was a test of sifting through information. It took some time for Lionel to realize that the main character of his trial was actually Mordred, and not someone else. Mordred, of course, had to deal with this same issue. But compared to Lionel, she had a much harder time deciphering the truth. This wasn't only because Lionel had an ability conducive to such analysis while she did not, but it was because it almost felt as though Lionel's life had not one, but two main characters to it. And the other character? It was exactly this young girl before her. When Mordred laid eyes on Aina, a welling of almost motherly sympathy burst out from her heart. "You poor girl, you have to treat yourself better. Your scars have flared up again." Aina flinched when she heard these words and involuntarily took a step back. Unlike Lionel, who had been there, she wasn't aware why Mordred would somehow know so much about her. Saying that her scars had flared up would be a simple observation for anyone. But to say again so familiarly, why did it feel like Mordred knew this wasn't the first time this had happened? Aina's scars had indeed been inflamed once again. In fact, they had a raging violet redness to them that was even more severe than when Lionel had seen them at their worst. After using the cleansing waters, they had calmed and appeared like normal scars. Though they were still ever present, they looked like normal knife wounds. But now they looked like they had been infested by a nasty infection once again. Having seen almost as much of Aina's life as she had seen of Lionel's, Mordred knew well that Aina's scars only flared up like this when she used them to facilitate her training. Mordred sighed seeing Aina's reaction. She too felt that she was a bit too rash with her words. Aina had no idea that she had seen most of her life as well. "May I come in?" Mordred asked. By now, Mordred was certain that Lionel wasn't present. "Damned boy, how can you be so bad with women?" She's clearly in a distressed state, yet you've gone off and disappeared. As much as Mordred knew about Aina's life, she knew even more about Lionel's. She knew how easily he detached himself. Whether it came to his mother or James, she didn't think that anything would change when it came to Aina either. Unfortunately, Lionel might have high emotional intelligence, but even he couldn't be perfect. He still had some things to learn, it seemed. Aina nodded. Mordred sighed. Come. Let's get you an ice pack. I'm sure that this can't feel very good. Aina wasn't sure why she allowed Mordred to enter, truthfully. Despite Mordred's talks of an ice pack, Aina never mentioned the fact Lionel's cleansing waters could likely heal her back to her previous state. I want to fight, Aina suddenly said. Fight? Mordred was stunned. Yes, I want to join the battlefield. But I wasn't sure who to talk to, so I've been waiting here. Mordred hesitated. She was hoping to help Aina out a bit, maybe spend some time with the young girl. After all, if there was anyone who understood what it felt like to be alone, it was Mordred. But something about it made her realize that it was almost too difficult to say no to this girl. It looked as though if she said no, Aina would go off on her own to find her own battles. Thinking back to the scenes Mordred had seen of Aina's life, Mordred could only grit her teeth and agree. The last time that monster came out of her, she and Lionel were in that French zone. I need to be there if it happens again. Chapter 462. Though it might seem isolated, news of the war between Earth and Terrain spread like a wildfire throughout the universe. It could be said that a world wasn't truly considered to be a part of the dimensional verse until it entered the fourth dimension. But Earth in specific was wildly eyed by powerful entities due to its potential. It was exactly because of this that war between two mere fourth-dimensional worlds had suddenly become such a hot topic. The truth was that though Earth was favored, it was the world itself that was, not its people. Who cared which citizens populated it as long as the world existed? In fact, many other fourth-dimensional worlds were quite jealous of Terrain. The truth was that Terrain was the only fourth-dimensional world close enough to execute such a war plan. It wasn't by coincidence that Lionel and Aina could reach with a single talisman. These words peeled back the requirements for such an invasion to succeed. Firstly, two worlds had to exist on the same plane. It would be almost impossible for a fifth-dimensional world, or above, to accomplish such a thing. Or, more accurately, the price they would need to pay to do this wouldn't be worth it. This was also why Terrain needed to wait until Earth evolved. The second requirement was closeness. The universe was too vast. It would be impossible for another fourth-dimensional world from a wildly different quadrant to even dream of attacking Earth. Terrain happened to meet both of these requirements, and now its actions were a hotly discussed topic. But while most of the universe was just observing curiously, there was a group of people that was infuriated. The powers of Terrain. If there was one group of people that was completely caught off guard by this, even more than the people of Earth, it was these powers. In one moment, they were negotiating terms to sell themselves to a higher power, and in the next moment, half the value of their world was plundered and taken. Who's going to explain to me how this happened? A thunderous roar shook Cliff's Edge Terrace. Stop all your yelling. Is that going to get us anywhere? What did you say to me? Don't forget this is my territory, woman. Call me woman one more time and I'll peel your tongue out from your lips. Care to try me? Alright. This isn't getting us anywhere. You're only wasting more time. TSK, we should have known they were planning something like this. It was obvious that they were planning something, but attacking Earth takes some balls. I didn't think that they'd have the guts to do it. 3 individuals gathered. The male with a booming voice was the head of Cliff's Edge Terrace, Head Solar. The woman was the head of Mirage Pavilion, Head Mirage. And the mediator of the two was the head of World's End Falls, Head Falls. That's exactly what doesn't make any sense. Who gave them the guts? Do they have any idea how many hidden allies Earth has? Do they have any idea how many other powers are eyeing Earth? Do they have a death wish? It seems like you're still the same idiot. Head Mirage sneered, her cherry lips parting in disdain. What did you say to me? Just think for a minute, Blockhead. You think those people care about the people of Earth? Do you think there's such kindness in this world? The talents of Earth only come from those born on Earth. And even then, it isn't as though one can just go to a powerful world to birth a child and manifest a talent, or else everyone would do it. Obviously, the people of Earth are worth more than the people of our world, even if we started popping out babies over there right this second. You idiot, do you think you're the only one that knows that? Since you're still not getting it, I'll try to speak extra slowly. Headfalls rubbed his temples and shook his head. But in the end, he couldn't be bothered to stop their bickering again. A first-generation child is a baby which doesn't have a single parent from the world. They will gain at most a 20% blessing from the world, and won't be gifted with all of its potential. The remaining 80% will come from where the baby's parents originated. If the baby has at least one first-generation parent, they will receive 50% of the world's blessing, and will be considered a second-generation child. This will be the same even if both parents are first-generation. The percentages will not change. If the baby has at least one second-generation parent, they will receive 80% of the world's blessing. Once again, this will be the same even if both parents are second-generation. If the baby has at least one third-generation parent, they will receive 90%. At fourth generation, it will be 95%. And with a parent at the fifth generation, the baby will finally be considered a full-blown native. It's at fourth generation where things change. At that stage, if both parents are fourth generation, then their baby will receive 100% of the world's blessing, and also be considered a full native. Do you understand now? By this point, Het Solar wanted to explode. Did he look like a child? How could he not know these things? In fact, one of the most important things for a world to grasp after entering the fourth dimension, and truly becoming a part of the dimensional verse, was how to differentiate between immigrants and natives. There was no small number of people who wanted to take advantage of more talented worlds. In fact, even Terrain had to deal with this, let alone Earth. Do you really think I don't understand any of this? Clearly you don't. Het Mirage snapped. Our world is the only one in position to launch attacks from Earth for the foreseeable future. By the time any other worlds can come in and taste a piece of the pie, do you really think 5 generations wouldn't have passed by then? That's not even to mention the fact that there are plenty of 5th generation people on Earth right now. What's stopping them from being used like studs and sows? Het Solar froze. It seemed that this situation was far different from what he had imagined. Chapter 463. Het Solar calmed his rage and took a deep breath. So they're just taking a risk for a chance at survival? 5th-dimensional worlds are much more common than 4th-dimensional worlds. The number that would be in position to attack them is far more. Who's to say that with Earth's talent they'd even be able to establish themselves before they suffered the same fate? Though it was somewhat counterintuitive, after some thought it made more sense. It was best to consider the universe like a bell curve. It wasn't necessarily so that weaker worlds were more common. With the age of the dimensional verse, many worlds had had time to reach their potential. Due to the structure of things, the average talent of worlds was the 5th dimension. As such, the vast majority of worlds in the dimensional verse were within the 5th dimension. Likewise, the number of worlds within the 5th dimension that could attack Earth were likewise much more. If the cities won this war, how long would they get to enjoy it? A few decades at most? With Earth's potential, they likely wouldn't even need a century to cross yet another dimensional barrier. In fact, their situation is even worse than that. Het Solar sneered, suddenly thinking of something. Even if they really used Earth's people like sows and studs, it would take years for those children to mature. In the meantime, would they have the talent necessary to ensure that Earth wasn't swallowed by space-time? Talent was a double-edged sword. Though better talents would be born in such a world, their zones were likewise more difficult, and appeared more frequently as well. If those cities failed to clear the zones, Earth could very well be swallowed up. Het Falls sighed. Your words aren't wrong, but only partially. I'm sure you remember what happened in Brave City this time, right? Het Solar froze again. The heir of the Kafir family was accepted as a disciple of valiant Heart Mountain. It's with this added layer of protection that they dare to do this. Het Solar frowned. But doesn't Earth have that Lionel child? He heard from his son that there was a Lionel character who was accepted without even having to go through the trials. Wasn't Lionel standing even higher than Aneret's? How could this even count as protection? Yes, I've heard this as well. But this protection is only useful if two conditions are met. The first is that they have to be worlds that Valiant Heart Mountain can directly act against. Secondly, they have to have officially joined and have to have high standing. Not only has this Lionel child not officially joined, but Earth's attackers are members of the fourth dimension. This is not something Valiant Heart Mountain can interfere in. Head Solar sighed, slumping into his chair. Higher dimensional worlds couldn't interfere even if they wanted to. Not only would the price be high, but there were unspoken rules to think of. Wars between lower-level worlds were usually observed with one eye closed and another open by these behemoths. Only when the threats were of the fifth dimension would Valiant Heart Mountain begin to have some deterrence. They're banking on the Kiefer family heir joining in a few years and climbing up the disciple ranks. If only it were so simple. Head Falls sighed once again. I have reason to believe that the Kiefer family heir's success has little to do with what benefits Valiant Heart Mountain can provide, and much more about what his fiancée's family can. At this point, even Head Mirage, who had long since grasped everything, sat up. What do you know? She asked straightforwardly. It's only my speculation. Just speak, stop beating about the bush. Head Solar pressed. They both knew about Headfall's ability. If there were any deductions he could make, they would likely be very close to the truth. In reality, it was mostly because of this that they were caught off guard by things. They were so used to Headfall seeing through everything in advance that they never even suspected what might happen. Now they had been caught with their pants down. Headfalls took a deep breath. The appearance of young Miss Era is too mysterious. No one knows where she comes from, what strength she possesses, or what her goals are. All we know is that she is the fiancée to the Kiefer family heir, nothing more, nothing less. I contacted Shield Cross Stars to hopefully find out some information about her, but my contacts weren't able to get anything back to me. The expression of the two heads changed. This realization didn't mean that Era's standing was above Shield Cross Stars. This was almost impossible. After all, Shield Cross Stars was considered to be the police of the universe. There were few if any powers that could ignore their influence. What this truly meant was that Headfall's contacts weren't able to get him the information he needed. Simply put, their clearance wasn't high enough. This meant at least one thing for sure. Era wasn't from a world weaker than the fifth dimension. However, they did let slip one thing. According to them, a notice for fugitives was put out. Suspicious entities in all fourth-dimensional worlds within this star alignment were all marked with monitoring brands. But, most importantly, this order was requested by young Miss Era herself. As for what this means in totality, I'm not sure. But it for certain means that this young lady has the influence or, at the very least, the net worth necessary to accomplish such a thing. Head Solar's brows furrowed. What are you trying to get at? I feel you mean something more by telling us how potentially powerful she is, correct? Yes. Don't you think it's odd that, not to mention the fact the two haven't gotten married, but they haven't even set a date for their wedding yet? Almost like the Kefir family heir still hasn't proved himself yet. So, what kind of status would he gain once he did gain such acknowledgement? What if this acknowledgement is more important than any backing Valiant Heart Mountain could ever provide? The two had sucked in a cold breath before a deathly silence fell over the room. Then, what should we do? Head Mirage was the one to finally break the silence. Headfalls didn't answer for a long while. For a moment, the two thought that he might never respond at all. But when he finally did speak, they felt a swirl of complex emotions were surging within them. As things stand now, Earth still has a chance to defend itself. Though they're feeling the pressure, it isn't to the point their loss is guaranteed. As the saying goes, delivering coal in the winter is better than delivering water to an already smothered flame. What chance would Earth stand if instead of half our world's strength, it faced the entire brunt? Headfalls left the meeting of powers with a smirk on his face, a sharp glint lighting his eye. Chapter 464. Royal Blue Fort. The atmosphere was heated. The amount of pressure placed on the fort itself wasn't as great as one would have expected. At the very least, the colonists of Earth's 2 moons and the citizens of the capital were under far greater stress. The reason for this was obvious, but also placed the members of the fort in a terrible situation all the same. Unlike the capital, which had been revitalized and truly looked like a province once again, Royal Blue Province was still mostly in shambles. The only location of proper society was the fort. So why would the people of Terrain bother to attack right away? For different situations, different tactics were required. Camelot was a small terrain and mostly inhabited. As such, White City launched a full assault from the very beginning. Author's note: from now on, whenever Camelot is mentioned, assume it's in reference to Earth's 2nd moon unless the context says otherwise. However, Royal Blue Province was now mostly untouched territory. Other than the fort itself, the rest was just collapsed buildings, invalids, beasts, and the occasional outcast gang that overestimated themselves. Lionel had met such an outcast gang in the moments before he entered the Joan Zone. But he had dealt with them quite easily in his rage due to their grotesque remarks about Aina. These outcasts were fools who thought they would be able to avoid the hand of the Empire when things finally settled down, when in reality they would likely be among the first killed when things truly reached that point. But now, to the people of Terrain, these outcasts had become a hot commodity. Since Earth was such a new world, most of its original citizens, by default, were within the 5th generation and beyond. This made every Earthener the people of Terrain ran across a hotly contested item. Yes, item. Not person. This situation left the people of Earth in an odd limbo. The capital was under a full-blown assault and unable to lend out help, while the rest of Earth's land was being rapidly colonized. The only way to stop this would be to send out armies from the forts to slow them down. But how could these nobles that had just turtled themselves up dare to make a move so easily? They continued to cower within their walls, waiting for someone else to take action. After all, with the death of Miles, they could just pretend that they didn't have proper direction. Then everything would fall on the shoulders of the Governor Duke or the Secretary Marquisette. They wouldn't have to take any responsibility whatsoever. This was the harsh reality that peace could bring about. The sharpness the empire that once swept through Earth had dulled considerably. While there were no pushovers amongst nobles, it was also because of this that none of them wanted to rashly make a move. What if their sacrifice benefited another? How could they guarantee that their credit would be their own and not that of someone else's? This situation led to the fort closing its dome once again. As for the commoners on the outside, did they need to care for them? But it was in exactly this situation that the large oak doors to the gathering of nobles opened. A deathly silence fell. The number of people who dared to do such a thing were simply too few. And since it was unlikely to be a person of the capital, it was pretty clear to them all who this person was. As expected, the clicking of heels reverberated through the quiet congressional hall. A beauty strolled in, her hips swinging like a hypnotic pendulum. It didn't seem like she had done it on purpose, but rather that innate charm exuded from her very pores. Despite the fact they all knew she had been an old hag just a year prior, the men within the room couldn't help but feel their loins light on fire. Who else could this person be if not Secretary Marquisette Maya? After another long disappearance, she had finally come back once again. As though nothing had changed, she easily sat at the helm of the hall, not feeling as though there was anything wrong in the slightest. One of the nobles frowned. Secretary Marquisette, this isn't appropriate. As a chief earl, the chief law officer of Royal Blue Province, there were few who knew the law better than Chief Earl Fiel. The position of one's seating was highly important to setting precedential hierarchy. But Maya now sat in a position reserved for the Governor Duke. Even Miles hadn't been allowed to do this. In fact, Miles couldn't sit at any one of the leadership positions. Maya didn't respond directly. She only dug into her bosom and pulled out a noble crest. With a single look, any one of them could recognize it. Those rushing waters, the strong shield that blocked them from the lush grounds to its back. There was no doubt, this was the Luem family's crest. Chief Earl Fiel sat back down silently. There was already nothing more to say. In my absence, It seems that you all have had quite a bit of fun to yourselves, HM? Maya said lightly. The nobles remained silent. They couldn't understand how this woman who so rarely appeared still wielded so much power. Just how did she do it? It seems that you all have forgotten what it means to be the nobles of the Ascension Empire. You all have felt too comfortable for too long. His Majesty Emperor Fox has ordered a code black martial law state, effective immediately. At that moment, the nobles who had managed to maintain their cool shot out from their seats, shock coloring their features. A code black state? Wasn't that too rash? Such a state could only be called upon when the empire was in danger of falling, but they were still very far from this future. What the hell was going on? Of course, this was only a very small part of why they were all so shocked. Code Black martial law had the fewest laws and restrictions of any state. But it had one very important clause that shook the nobles to their core. In such a state, everything was earned by merits. When it concluded and everything returned to normal, even their very own noble positions would be up for grabs and exchangeable for merits. Even the title of Grand Prime Minister, or even Prince, could be exchanged for. As for those who didn't have enough merits, they would lose the noble seats they spent so much of their time protecting. Chapter 465. From now on I will be in charge. Secretary Marquisette Maya's demeanor completely shifted. From a coquettish, seductive air, the atmosphere around her became oppressive and heavy. It felt as though she had become a completely different person. No, it was like she had gone back to being that old hag of over a year ago. First, the scouting missions will be ramping up. I want anyone with speed, concealment and sensory abilities to be inserted in a reconnaissance unit effective immediately. The only exceptions I will allow are those in commanding roles. All Tier 5 admirals will be responsible for securing a 10-kilometer coastal buffer. The ocean has been ruled by beasts for too long. How useless are you all for allowing this to continue? All Tier 5 generals will be in rotating vanguard positions. I don't want there to be a single moment in any single day where there is not any pressure being applied on these jumping monkeys of terrain. How long do you intend to allow them to gallivant on our turf? Is this what being a noble means to you? General Umbred, General Sater, General Tudo, consider yourselves demoted. Your replacements will be the new General Milan, General Raj and General Joel. What? General Umbred stood in a rage, his mustache furiously blowing in all his anger. Sit down. Umbred felt a cold shiver course through his veins. He met Maya's cold gaze, completely unable to stop his body from trembling. While you were holding yourself up in the safety of this dome, those three led a vanguard against the invalid tide. Yet, you still dare to call yourself a general, and even raise your voice toward me? Who do you think you are? I sentence you to 3 years in Dark Cloud Prison. Take him away. Umbred froze in shock. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Dark Cloud Prison wasn't a death sentence for himself, but it was most definitely one for his career. He couldn't believe what was happening. He didn't even know who this Milan person replacing him was, nor did he know a Joel or Raj. All he knew was they had to be commoners because the only ones who would have led a vanguard against that invalid tide were those with no standing. All he had done was follow the lead of everyone else. Yet he was suffering the most. Even worse, because he couldn't control his temper, he ended up in an even worse position than the other two. Seeing such a scene, former General Sater and Tudo didn't even dare to breathe too heavily. They could only watch with sunken expressions as Umbred was escorted out of the hall. His expression dark as could be. No one who had a criminal record was allowed to hold a government position above Tier 3. Umbred was finished, and the legacy his family had built to now had all come crumbling down just with a few words. Do you all really think I don't know what's been happening in my absence? This sort of dereliction of duty will not be tolerated. Every offender will receive a more damning sentence than the last. The next person to step out of line will receive 5 years, the next 10. Don't try my patience. Maya continued as though nothing had happened, listing off her commands. The more the nobles listened, the more they realized that Maya had ears everywhere. Every one of her new laws of order was pointed at a very particular problem, that was almost impossible to notice on a whim. The more she spoke, the more the nobles felt their hearts tighten. They sat up straighter, their demeanor becoming several levels more respectful. At the same time, they began to look toward one another with wary gazes. The only way Maya could have managed this was if she had informants. But it was impossible to tell who they were. It left them all on the edge of their seats. They had no idea who had been secretly observing them all. As clever men and women used to the world of politics, they tried to pay attention to who Maya put in positions of power, trying to see if they could deduce who to be wary of in the future. But the more they tried to deduce, the more frustrated they became. The only obvious promotion Maya handed out was to those 3 commoners. The rest were either inconsequential, or didn't change much at all. It left them all in a state of limbo, as though they were suspended above an abyss they could fall to the bottom of at any time. If they didn't know Maya was doing this on purpose by now, they wouldn't be worth the noble titles they had. With this kind of perpetual pressure, which of them would dare to step out of line? Finally, reorganize the inner city and make room for the commoners to enter. Level the outer city and repurpose the steel walls for some more practical defenses. The nobles felt like cleaning out their ears. What did Maya say just now? Allow the commoners in? Maya's words were final. She didn't even bother to explain herself from start to finish. She never gave a reason for anything, but deep inside, the nobles knew exactly why she made every decision. This was the only one they couldn't quite wrap their minds around. But Maya didn't give some heartfelt speech about the importance of the people to convince them. She simply left her words behind and swayed her hips to leave. Internally, Maya giggled. Consider this a repayment of your favor, Lionel. You helped me gain the foothold I wanted in the Slayer Legion. And now I've reformed Royal Bluefort to your ideals. Be sure to put in a good word for me to your Gramps. Maya smiled lightly, her mind spinning at speeds that could rival even Lionel's. As for what her plans and goals were, maybe only Maya herself knew this. Maya suddenly sped up her steps. Don't worry, Mommy's coming. Maya happily sashayed away. She really didn't like being away from her child. Even though the doctors swore the incubator was top of the line, she still preferred to oversee it all personally. On Camelot. Khaled is dead. Author's note below December 17th, 21. Chapter 466. One would think that such a report would have landed on City Lord White's desk a long time ago. However, the City Lord wasn't the type of woman who enjoyed listening to reports on what she deemed as useless points. All she cared about was the result. Not only had the Lynn barony fallen, but it had fallen within the time frame she had set. The number of soldiers she had lost were less important to her than the tasks they managed to complete. This might sound like a maddening philosophy to have, even to the point where it dehumanized one's own subordinates, and even worse, could be seen as foolish, but it was clear that City Lord White didn't care about the optics of such things. In the end, the result was an odd situation where City Lord White only learned about the passing of one of her white knights over a week later. Naya nodded. Yes, City Lord. He died along with 511 predator ravens. During the siege of the Lynn and Provaux baronies, we lost 37 of our 1022 men before managing to claim their territory. Soldier Cop took over White Knight Dior's position, and has been taking control of the law and order of the troops. City Lord White waved a hand. Why are you telling me all of this? Naya didn't seem surprised the City Lord White didn't care about all these details. In truth, she wanted to be out on the battlefield herself, but this was a war where White City was just a single gear in a working system. She couldn't do as she pleased. She had to follow the plans laid out by the Kiefer family. This left her feeling quite antsy and irritable. She only managed to keep things together since it was Naya who was speaking. If it was anyone else, they likely would have tasted Clara by now. And the only reason Naya had such a pass wasn't because City Lord White allowed nonsense from her. Rather, it was because the City Lord was aware that Naya knew better than to waste her time. So if Naya was bringing this up, it meant she had a very good reason to do so. There was a reason Naya was the only one allowed to be so near the City Lord so consistently. According to a report sent by Acting Commander Kopp, White Knight Dior lost in single combat at the hands of a child by the name of Lionel Morales. City Lord White's annoyed expression faded, and she looked up at Naya. Naya nodded once again despite the fact City Lord White hadn't actually spoken any words. There are 3 things that we have to pay great attention to during this war. The first is the interference of the hidden families. The second is the interference of higher dimensional worlds. And lastly, we have to pay particular attention to the wielders of the world spirit. According to what is known, the second, third and fourth completers have well-known identities. However, the first completer has yet to be found. According to our intelligence and deductions, there are 3 individuals who have the potential to be the first completer. One of these individuals is expressly this Lionel Morales. City Lord White slowly stood. The world spirit, even in comparison to the interference of higher dimensional worlds, was the greatest potential variable of this world. The good news was that the world spirit should have been split into 4 parts. When in such a sparse situation, the abilities of the world spirit were significantly nerfed to the point of practically having no use. This in addition to the fact the abilities of world spirits were quite infantile at the early stages of such a world, and it wouldn't be a large problem even if it was whole. However, the world spirit is what truly decided sovereignty over a world. Terrain had to ensure to grasp at least one of these 4 portions. Only by doing so would they be able to truly lay claim to this world. Also, though she is not among the most likely 3 I just mentioned, there is intelligence that Aina Brazinger is currently present on the battlefields. From our intelligence, she has a very close relationship with Lionel Morales. So, although she's unlikely to have been the first completer, getting to her would be valuable, regardless. Why do you wait so long to bring such information to me? I finally get to set out. City Lord wait. Naya raised her voice slightly so that City Lord White didn't just storm off. If this short-haired woman caught a head of steam, it would be almost impossible to stop her. What is it? It isn't appropriate to make a move just yet. Our original plan didn't account for the Empire already having a presence on this moon already. But, it seems that before we appeared, the Empire had already sent Prince Noah Fox here to lead an army to assimilate Camelot and the Demon Empire. Noah Fox, isn't that? Yes, the 3rd completer, Prince Noah Fox. Isn't that even better? That means there are 2 potential world spirit pieces here. While this is true, it also means that we have to be careful. Prince Fox has already begun to lead a counterattack, and we've already lost half of the territory we initially snatched due to poor foundations. Isn't that just more reason for me to go? Why are you wasting my time? City Lord White's expression darkened. Yes, it is important that you go, but not so that you can target Lionel Morales. We need to prepare a proper counterattack and sweep through Camelot in a single sweep. I suggest that you wait for us to turn Lynn and Provaux baronies into proper launch points. Both are important resources. Lynn barony is a choke point that separates the kingdom from the wilderness. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's perfect for starving them of natural resources, whether that be wood or fresh water. Provaux barony forms the final point of a triangle between Lynn barony and Camelot, and is a final barrier to the no-man's land that separates Camelot and the Demon Empire. It's a perfect launch point to attack both the Demon Empire and the kingdom. We will secure the supply lines, cut off Camelot's resources, and create a perfect foundation for attack. Then you can move out, City Lord. City Lord White stared at Naya deeply for a moment before sitting back down. How much time? 2 months at the fastest, 3 at the latest. Fine. I'll let them live for a little longer then. Chapter 467. The people of Terrain had no idea that the world spirit hadn't been separated into 4 like it would on other worlds. In Earth's case, a rare instance to be sure, the world spirit chose its host before the metamorphosis began. But somehow, this news was kept as a complete secret. Even after years of preparation, Terrain was completely unaware. That said, could they be blamed? A 4th-dimensional world with limited talent and scope like Terrain wasn't even aware that a world spirit could make such autonomous decisions at such an early stage. Due to the fact they weren't aware, They weren't even looking for it before Earth's metamorphosis began. As the saying went, you didn't know what you didn't know. How could Terrain be aware of something they weren't even aware they should be aware about in the first place? After the metamorphosis began, Terrain used special channels to learn about who the 4 completers were. Through their investigations, they managed to learn about 3 of them. The third completer of which was Prince Noah Fox, of course. No one was aware of the fact that due to him waking up so much earlier than everyone else, Lionel was by far the first to complete his own. In fact, the time difference was a staggering several-month gap. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel was injured to the point of falling into a coma and having to be nursed back to health by Uncle Montez, he would have exited long before anyone else, and his status as the first completer would have been more obvious to all. But for now, others could only speculate about his identity. Still, even then, Lionel's performance was so dazzling that he had become a prime suspect regardless. Prince Noah Fox stood tall on a battlefield, his breathing almost too even. It was difficult to tell that he had just been in a battle to begin with. Despite the fact the corpses of his enemies laid before him, their blood dripping from the blade of his saber, he didn't seem happy in the slightest. They're stalling. Noah spoke to no one in particular. This white city was exceptionally cruel. Without thought for casualties, they threw army after army of troops at them. It was as though they wanted them to waste time cutting them all down like they were weeds to be disgusted by rather than people. In truth, Noah was indifferent to it all. He just didn't like what it could possibly mean. Since they were stalling, there had to be a purpose for it. So what was that purpose exactly? At that moment, an agile black wolf of over 3 meters tall shot to Noah's side. In one instant, it was as swift as the wind, and in the next it came to a grinding halt without warning. It was as though it had never been running to begin with. A petite young woman with short hair swooped down from the top of the wolf. "Your Highness, it may be time to begin to coordinate with Camelot and the Demon Empire. It's clear that they've prepared for a long time and know more about us than we do them. Though we've won all of our battles, they're hollow victories." Jessica spoke as plainly as she always did. It had already been a month since Noah had a conversation with his grandfather. In that time, he had managed to reclaim over half the territory White City had taken from Camelot, but there were a few problems with this. For one, technology wasn't functioning as it once had. Without it, it wasn't possible to erect forts like they had on Earth with any sort of speed. So though they had reclaimed the land, it was more like they had pushed out White City's presence. Secondly, White City had managed to keep a strict hold of 2 strategic points even to now. Though they lost battles without a care, they always managed to keep control over what was truly important. Thirdly, they hadn't originally come here for such a long, drawn-out war. Thanks to their skills, food and water wasn't a problem, but there was more than this one needed for war. They needed a steady supply of weapons and weapon maintenance options, which they didn't have. They needed healers and doctors, but they were in short supply of them. And they needed numbers in order to keep control and scout out the areas they had taken hold of. But they had none of these things. Due to this, Noah had hoped to make a strong push and place White City on its back foot as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, though he succeeded, the issue was that their success wasn't great enough to warrant any sort of happiness. It was essentially hollow. Noah nodded. "I agree. I believe we've displayed enough of our strength." With a shake of his wrist, a strong vibration shot through Noah's blue-bladed saber. His strength caused the metal to bend and groan, whipping the blood on its way. In an instant, the blade was once again spotless. "Should we arrange a meeting?" "No. We will meet on the battlefield," Noah said plainly. "Understood." While Noah was leading attacks toward Pervaux Barony, heading a charge from the direction of No Man's Land, Camelot and the Demon Empire was heading a charge toward Lynn Barony. Yet, despite this pincer attack from both sides, White City continued to fend off their attempts. The dauntless approach of the soldiers of White City shook the knights and mages of Camelot to the core. To be so fearless in death, even after so many battles, wore on the souls of their enemies, making them feel as though this was a battle they would never win. As a result, despite the fact King Arthur had been experiencing maybe the most peaceful time of his life, it was overshadowed by a perpetual fog that hung over Camelot. What didn't help was the fact Camelot lacked the same level of organization White City's armies did. And as their knights and mages awakened to their new abilities, it made the battlefield even more chaotic than they should have been. Without proper guidance on how to use these suddenly newfound powers, Camelot's victories were even more Pyrrhic than Noah's had been. It was on this day, on yet another battlefield, that Aina could be found, her lips tightly sealed as she swung her great sword toward another enemy. Chapter 468. Aina felt her arms trembling on impact. She could see the indifferent eyes of the White City soldier through their crossed blades. However, despite the dull pain in her arms and the trembling of her knees, her gaze too remained unmoved. Somewhere deep inside, she quite appreciated these soldiers of White City. Their emotionless, unquestionable resolve toward battle, as though they could forget about everything else other than the opponents before them. She too could resonate with this feeling. While Lionel felt an excitement when he laid eyes on a battlefield, Aina felt a soothing calm. However, the raging blood in her veins told a completely different story. Unfortunately, this battlefield was completely unlike the battles Aina had experienced in the Joan Zone, or even against the Invalids and Braziner family members she faced alongside Lionel. Whereas in those battles, she reaped lives as though they were weeds. On this battlefield she felt as though it was her own life that was constantly in danger. Even finding an opponent like this whom she was evenly matched with was a problem. This wasn't because Aina was too weak, but rather because the soldiers of White City were simply too strong. Aina needed to exchange several moves to take down just a single one. And since this was a battlefield and not a sanctioned duel, how could it possibly be that she would always be allowed a one-on-one battle? Aina dug deep, a light shout parting her lips as she pressed her great sword forward. An audible snap rang out. But on such a large battlefield, the only two who likely heard it were Aina and the soldier before her. Other than a light flash in his gaze, the soldier didn't show any other reaction to Aina's blade piercing through his shoulder and cutting down through his hip. Aina took deep breath, her amber eyes shooting forward as though already looking for a new opponent. But she quickly found that there were already none left. At that moment, an irrational rage welled up in her heart as she pulled her sword out from the corpse before her. Unfortunately, this small action caused her legs to tremble beneath the weight she carried. Aina stabbed her sword into the ground, her body almost unable to continue standing. Heal, Aina urged through her own thoughts, forcing her body to rapidly repair itself. The strain caused her scars to become even more inflamed. If others were paying attention, it would become very obvious that the restrictions Aina was under didn't leave even her ability be. Just as Aina's vision was swimming, she suddenly felt an arm wrap around her shoulders. She looked up to find Mordred looking toward her with a worried expression. Mordred was quite tall for a woman, almost a head taller than Aina. Even so, her visage was quite clear. "Are you all right?" Aina nodded faintly. Mordred wanted to say more, but her expression suddenly changed. "It can't be another one?" Mordred's brow furrowed. "Is there a problem?" Aina looked around the battlefield, but from what she could see, it was another victory. Though they had lost quite a number of knights and mages, it was still a victory nonetheless. Those that hadn't died had already long since retreated, so it was hard to tell what reason there could possibly be to have such a reaction. That said, Aina was also very much aware that her sensory abilities weren't very good. So, she deferred to the most talented mage of Camelot. Aside from maybe Lionel, it was doubtful that there was anyone else on this moon with stronger internal sight in comparison to the Demon Empress. Mordred's brows furrowed tighter. "It's another army. I thought it was more men from White City, but it seems like this isn't the case. If it's not them, then it's more likely that it's the Empire?" According to what Mordred knew, the Empire had been attacking from the direction of Provoz's barony. Though it hadn't been expressly stated, their actions most definitely took a lot of pressure off of Camelot, and allowed the Demon Empire to focus all their thoughts on support. What Mordred expected the least, though, was that they'd leave their pincer position and come here. What purpose did they have for doing this? It can't be that they wanted to attack Camelot now, right? At the moment, This battlefield was under Mordred's command, and the large majority of the troops were demons. As for King Arthur's armies, they were on the more northern wing of the battlefield. This was for the best. Though they now had an alliance, one couldn't just magically forget the past enmities between humans and demons. So trying to fuse them into one fighting force would be like asking for problems to break out. This was all to say that in order for the Empire to make it to them, they would most definitely have to go through Mordred and her men first. It doesn't look like they came to battle, but it doesn't look like they came on friendly terms either. After a while passed, the Empire's armies finally entered Aina's sensory ranges. She was exceptionally sensitive to matters related to battle, and could read the air quite well. The Empire definitely wasn't here for peace, but they didn't seem to be here to battle either. One might want to say that they came here as a neutral party, but it wasn't quite that either. At the helm of the army, Prince Noah Fox stood on the back of a black wolf. Despite its swaying body, he didn't seem to be impacted in the slightest. To his back, a group of nearly 1,000 followed along. Many were also riding such wolves, but others rode various other beasts. Though the army wasn't completely uniform due to this, they still carried an oddly structured and strict air to them. Even their mismatching beasts couldn't detract from this. It didn't take Mordred much to realize that these beasts were actually the demonic beasts of No Man's Land. Somehow, the Empire had subjugated and domesticated these wild beasts even to the point of taking them to war. Noah had no idea that this action alone left Mordred in more awe than any of their combined other actions had. Only she, who had been trying to reel in and reign over these beasts for decades, knew exactly how difficult it was. What was their goal here, exactly? Chapter 469. The slow approach of the Empire's warriors eventually put Mordred at ease. It seemed that Aina's words had been correct. If their goal was to attack, they would have long since broken out into a charge. But their current pace was almost like a leisurely stroll. In fact, they even allowed Mordred enough time to reorganize her army and face their entourage head-on. By now, Arthur's warriors had also noticed the oddity. "Your Majesty, should we send someone?" Arthur shook his head. "I will go personally. Allow the men some rest and treat the injured. There's no telling when they will choose to attack again." Noah's troops came to a halt about 100 meters from Mordred's front line. Without a word, a small squad of 5 broke off, riding their black wolves forward swiftly. Though their pace was still a bit faster than the army had been, it still didn't seem like their goal was to attack. The group of 5 was led by a young man. The expression on his face was indifferent and lofty. He carried the air of arrogance nobility should have, but without allowing it to grow overblown. It was just enough to put many in a state of awe without allowing them to feel any sort of disgust. It was clear that this young man's air of superiority was ingrained down to his very bones. When the small squad made it to within 5 meters of Mordred, they came to a stop, maintaining a healthy distance. "I am the representative of His Highness, Prince Noah Fox, Junior Governor Duke Niall Briarmouth. Who is your leader?" Niall's voice boomed over the battlefield. He didn't seem to realize that Mordred was right before him. Whether he did it on purpose or not, it was hard to tell. However, regardless, Mordred maintained her composure. She had been through much more in her life. If there was one thing she was excellent at, it was maintaining her calm. "I am the leader of the Demon Empire," she said unhurriedly. "I am the leader of Camelot." At that moment, Arthur had made his way to Mordred's side. His expression wasn't as calm as his daughter's. Rather, it still held a lofty air. Niall looked down from his position atop his wolf, sweeping a glance over the two of them. His gaze happened to catch upon Aina, her appearance causing him to frown. Her face made him inwardly uncomfortable, but he hid it well. There was no need to linger on such things. Though he could be wild at other times, it was unnecessary at this moment. But just when he planned to focus on Arthur and Mordred once again, his lips even opening to speak, his gaze sharpened. He looked back toward Aina, his eyes landed on the hand she used to lean against her great sword with. No, it was more accurate to say that his gaze landed on the wrist of the hand she was using. Even at this moment, Aina's breathing was still a bit haggard. The only reason she was still at the front of the army was because Mordred had insisted on keeping her by her side, because she was worried about Aina's current state. For the past month and a half or so, Aina had done nothing but battle. It was hard to allow such a petite young girl to bear such a burden on her shoulders constantly, but Aina insisted to the point Mordred couldn't reject. Aina didn't think anyone would be talking to her at this moment, so she was entirely focused on her recovery. She was trying to force her ability to activate again, but it had slowed down considerably. Her reaction, though, caused Niall's frown to deepen. As though finally sensing that the atmosphere was oddly silent, Aina looked up, only to find that Niall's gaze was locked onto her. Of course, Aina was confused by this. She wasn't well known among the nobles. And even if she was, this definitely wouldn't be the face they recognize. Beyond that, she didn't share the red hair and eyes of the Brazinger family. Even one of her own family members only managed to recall her due to his perfect recall ability, and he had long since been buried beneath dozens of meters of earth. So it was even less likely that she'd be remembered for this. State your name and which province you come from. Are you planning on defecting from the Empire? Niall's gaze sharpened, boring into Aina as though trying to force her into a confession. Yet, despite looking up toward Niall with tired eyes, Aina didn't seem intimidated in the slightest. What a joke. If Aina could remain calm and unperturbed beneath Lionel's aura, what was a mere junior governor duke worth? Of course, at this moment, Aina wasn't necessarily thinking of things in such simple terms. She only knew that she was unmoved by it all. In fact, she was even slightly annoyed. Compared to others, Aina was actually quite thankful for the Empire. If not for it, she would have likely suffered even more hardship as a child. But Aina's main priority was still revenge. What the Empire cared about her actions toward reaching this goal meant little to nothing to her. My name is Aina Brazinger. I come from Royal Blue Province. No, I have no intention of defecting from the Empire. Aina replied somewhat wearily. Then how is it that you are here and not protecting Royal Blue Fort? Niall's words froze. Did you just say Aina Brazing? Niall suddenly remembered that almost a year ago now, they received a report that they would be gaining 2 more variants from Royal Blue Fort. One was a certain Lionel Morales, and the second was Aina Brazinger. But for whatever reason, those 2 never appeared. Due to Earth's talents, after over a year of development, the rarity of variants had plummeted as well. From just a handful, it had blossomed to several thousand. In fact, in their current army, not a single one wasn't a variant. Of course, those who were variants from the very beginning were far more valuable. And Lionel and Aina were among this very rare few. In fact, considering where they started, they should be among the few who already had abilities within the 5th dimension. However, with this didn't come leniency. Rather, it made Aina's wrongdoings several times more severe. The action of not properly reporting to the capital could be considered a direct defiance of the Emperor's will. After reaching this point in his thoughts, Niall's aura became baleful. Chapter 470. Seeing that the situation was taking a turn for the worse, Mordred took a step forward and blocked Aina to her back, feeling slightly protective of this young girl. Aina is not tied with us, she is only here as a helper. Mordred tried to explain. Niall's gaze remained locked onto Aina. Aina felt her vision swimming, her feet feeling somewhat unsteady. From an outsider's perspective, it seemed as though she was feeling pressured by Niall's gaze. But the reality was that her body seemed to want to shut down at this moment. After several minutes of trying to force her ability to activate, her situation only got worse. In fact, it seemed as though the repressive effects of her scars was getting fiercer. Without the energy she needed to fight back against it, the situation she was facing only grew worse. The reason she is here is irrelevant. The fact that she is here at all is already a challenge to His Majesty's sovereignty. The momentum of Niall, and the 4 wolf riders to his back grew. In the Ascension Empire, there were only a handful of titles without a democratic prefix attached to it. The reason behind this was clear. Other than the royal family, others had to constantly scratch and claw for their positions. Any failure to do so would result in the destruction of countless generations of effort. Due to this structure, the empire had fostered a sense of complete and unquestionable loyalty. Those who failed to meet such standards could just as easily be ostracized during the next cycle of elections. It was also exactly because of this reason that there were no noble families with useless heirs, as useless heirs would only drive the effort of the family into the ground. If Niall was found to have been aware of a traitor to the empire, yet hadn't taken action, the consequences would be unimaginable. To begin with, the Briarmouth family didn't hold control over a powerful province. In fact, his evergreen province was located in harsh wintry climates year-round, resulting in an economy that was somewhat crippled. They lacked resources or tourist-worthy locations. To compensate for this, the evergreen province was, ironically, a province filled with factories and was as such ranked 8th amongst the provinces. And unfortunately, the only reason they were not ranked 9th was because Dark Cloud Province, the location of Dark Cloud Prison, was considered unranked. It could be considered a blessing to the family that Niall had awakened as a variant and had had the opportunity to stay by the prince's side for the past year. But he was also aware that his standing, even compared to some secretary Marquisate families, was lacking. As such, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He had to uphold the justice of the empire properly. By this point, though, Aina's mind was far too foggy to consider her surroundings. She stumbled and fell backward, only to be caught by Mordred, who realized that something had gone wrong. But Niall had yet to finish speaking. And I also hope that as a power soon to be under the jurisdiction of the empire, that you wouldn't be harboring a criminal, correct? Niall's gaze landed on Mordred and Arthur once again, his words far more forceful. In the distance, Noah remained unmoved by it all. The distance was only 100 meters, so with his newfound strength, he could easily hear the words Niall was speaking. Since he didn't find anything wrong with Niall's approach, he didn't make any moves. Aina Brasinger, is it? Noah's jaw steeled. He recognized this name. Could she be from that family? But she didn't have the signature hair and eye color. Though Earth couldn't be considered as large as the universe, obviously, there were still many instances of unrelated people having the same last names. Knowing this, it was no wonder even those who were aware of the Morales name didn't automatically assume Lionel's origins. But in a world as small as Earth, especially after the eradication of over 99% of their population, such instances should be much rarer. Was there really such a coincidence? It was no surprise that Noah was sensitive to the names of these hidden families. His grandfather had said that there were many enemies eyeing their Earth, and these hidden families were no exception. Noah wasn't quite sure of the origin of these families, but there were two running theories he had come up with under his own research and a bit of Jessica's help. The first possibility was that these hidden families were existences that once vied for supremacy over Earth like their Fox family had. Though it was easy to ignore it, but didn't their Fox family also all have the same white gold hair and emerald green eyes? When Noah realized this on a certain day not that many years ago, he felt as though his whole world had been flipped upside down. Could it really be that their Fox family was just another hidden family that happened to claim victory? It was possible. But there was also a second possibility as well. This possibility was far more sinister. And if this was true, Noah would stop at nothing to eradicate these hidden families. With so many higher dimensional worlds eyeing them, could it really be possible that none of them took any measures to claim a piece of Earth for themselves? What if the hidden families were actually branch members of higher dimensional worlds that sent their people here in order to reach the 5th generation as quickly as possible? If that was the case, wouldn't that mean that those higher dimensional worlds weren't as far away as they all thought? As for which of these two theories was correct, Noah had no idea. But what he did know was that he couldn't allow someone with the Brasinger family name to run around freely. And even if Aina's last name wasn't Brasinger, her crimes alone would have definitely warranted detainment. Seize her, Niall said coldly. We'll take her back to the capital for trial after all of this is over. Author's note below. December 20th, 21. Chapter 471. Mordred felt slightly panicked. Obviously, this wasn't because she feared Niall's strength. whether it be by her own opinion or by the fact of reality. The truth was that there were very few on the current earth that could match Mordred in power. The issue was that this wasn't a situation she could brute force her way out of. Even if she easily deflected the advancement of these wolf riders, what would she do about the 1,000-strong army to their back? And even if they somehow managed to repel them, what would happen to the situation with White City if they suddenly began to infight? Even though the Empire seemed to be helping now, Mordred and Arthur alike were very much aware that Camelot wasn't their home ground. The Empire could easily choose to retreat and focus on Earth and come back. But could they do the same? They could technically find a place on Earth, but what could their millions of citizens do? Where would they place them? Unlike on Earth, where many if not most had some level of combat prowess by now and had tempered themselves over a year of hardship, the people of Camelot were still lagging behind in this aspect. Even as they awakened to their abilities, they were completely unused to using them, and would be even more useless on a battlefield. To make matters worse, Camelot didn't have a monitoring system like Earth did, so rounding everyone up would likely take months. By then, how many more would they lose? Boy, I think that's enough. At that moment, King Arthur took a step forward. The sight of his valiant heir and white lion engraved armor was something to behold indeed. Despite having chosen to yield to the Empire, that kingly air of his hadn't diminished in the slightest. He only stood there before his daughter and Aina, yet it felt as though the beasts engraved onto his white armor had come to life, causing the black wolves Nile and the other road to tremble slightly. They might have been demon beasts, but just how many of these beasts had Arthur killed in his life? He had long since lost count. Nile frowned. "Are you sure that you're aware of what you're doing?" "I'm well aware of what I'm doing. I have no idea what laws of your land this child has broken, but what I do know is that she's been fighting for our and your sake all this time. Is this what your empire does to those that fight for them?" Nile's expression grew cold. "Are you questioning the Empire? I have yet to become one of your people." Arthur replied just as coldly, taking a step forward that forced the shivering black wolves into an even sorrier position. "In fact, I believe that in your minds, I am still nothing but a fairy tale. Is that correct?" Arthur scanned the five before him, and even sent a glance toward Noah in the distance. Despite meeting Arthur's gaze, Noah remained unmoved. A clash of royal air shot through the battlefield, making the atmosphere several times heavier. "I may be just an inconsequential fictional character in your minds, but you shouldn't forget that you're currently standing on my fictional lands, breathing my fictional air, and are in my fictional presence. Until the day Camelot cedes to the Empire, this will still be the case. If you want to take people under my protection beneath my nose, you'll have to taste my blade first." The black wolves reeled and whined, kicking up to their hind legs. If it wasn't for the strength of their riders, Nile and the others would have definitely been kicked off. Nile didn't seem to notice the poor performance of his black wolf. His eyes remained locked onto Arthur as though he was prepared to attack at any given moment. "Nile, return." Noah's cold voice rang through the battlefield. His words alone seemed to dispel Arthur's aura, calming the black wolves down in an instant. The contrast was so drastic that even Arthur himself narrowed his eyes. Nile didn't hesitate to follow Noah's orders, clicking his heels against the coat of his wolf and dashing back to the Empire's troops. Mordred looked toward her father's back with a complicated glance. On one hand, Mordred knew that this had always been her father's character. He wasn't a man who took kindly to others looking down on him. But, by the same token, over the years, he had begun to somewhat allow others to trample over him. It seemed as though Arthur was overly prideful, but hadn't he allowed the church and the thoughts of the nobles to dictate his own thoughts for a long time? There was no doubt that he had been hypocritical in this aspect in the past, but now he managed to hold his head high even after choosing to submit to the Empire. This was in stark contrast to the him of the past. It even brought a smile to Mordred's face before she could even reel it back in. It was at that very moment that Aina suddenly collapsed completely. "Aina." Mordred was shocked. She had been propping Aina up from the very beginning, so she immediately realized the change in the weight she had to uphold. When Aina could no longer support her own self, Mordred was at a loss because even she herself almost collapsed. What the hell is this weight? This girl. Mordred sent a glance toward Aina's great sword and the massive curved box on her back. This was a level of weight that even a 3-star Grand Knight wouldn't be able to carry around, let alone do battle with. What the hell was this little girl thinking? Mordred took action immediately, doing her best to pry the sword out of her hands and the package off her back. But Aina's grip was so steely that Mordred found she couldn't budge it in the slightest. Aina's face flushed red before draining into a sickly pale color. Her breathing became short and somewhat hurried, her lips slightly parted. Mordred's eyes widened. F.A. Mordred hesitated. But luckily, Arthur turned back in time to see his daughter's pleading gaze. Please heal her. Arthur's gaze became serious as he nodded. But just when he was about to take action, the Empire's troops moved. I'm greatly disappointed by your choice, Arthur. Noah's black wolf stalked forward, the army to his back moving as one. I'll give you another chance. An oppressive aura surged out from Noah, a blue-bladed saber appearing in his hand. The moment it did, the black wolf beneath his feet collapsed, its spine snapping in half beneath the weight. Yet Noah's steps didn't falter in the slightest, his aura only growing with an added bloodthirsty air. Arthur's gaze became serious as he turned back. But no one expected for the situation at that moment to change once again. Hi! Beating war drums and blaring horns sounded from the distance. A woman with short hair, dressed in black robes accented by white flexible armor, and wielding a massive 2-headed hammer stood at the helm of an army, her battle aura towering. Chapter 472. The battlefield was suddenly thrust into an unseemly situation. Camelot and the Demon Empire faced off against the Empire, but now there was White City who had suddenly inserted themselves into the mix. Arthur, Mordred and Noah could immediately tell with absolute certainty that this army of White Cities was much different than it had been in the past. Its aura was more oppressive, its momentum much more frightening, and the commander at its helm was on a completely different level. Noah's sharp gaze swept toward City Lord White's direction. They were still over a kilometer away, but by the time they broke out into a charge, it wouldn't even take a few minutes for them to cross over the final distance. Meralda. Yes, Empress? The moment Mordred called out, a succubus demon stepped forward. Take Aina to the back line. Take some help with you to carry her things. Meralda blinked in slight confusion. Did she really need help for this? But her expression changed when Mordred passed over Aina's unconscious body. Succubi were known for their strong spirit pressure. But as demons, they also had bodies stronger than the average human knight. And Meralda in particular was a hand-picked protector for the Demon Empress, so it wouldn't be a surprise if she was many times stronger than the average succubus. Yet even she nearly collapsed. Without a choice, Meralda listened to her Empress' words and quickly shuttled Aina away with the help of several others. Aina's breathing continued to grow more erratic, her body becoming almost scalding to the touch. Despite the fact the temperature of Camelot was quite mild, her body billowed with steam as though she might erupt at any moment. Meralda wasn't sure what she could do about this. She wasn't a healer. All she could do was move Aina to the backline and hope the medical professionals could do something for her. Noah and Niall watched as Aina was being taken away, but they didn't say a word. This already wasn't a situation where they could continue to push their luck. Arthur's gaze narrowed. Their armies were currently facing Noah's. To face City Lord White, they would have to maneuver and shift their vanguard around, but doing such a thing was easier said than done. At the very least, Camelot didn't have such good military structure. In such a situation, even a well-disciplined army would face issues. To make matters worse, they had all just come out of a long, hard-fought battle. The battlefield itself hadn't even been properly cleared yet. This was completely unlike White City's previous pattern. Usually they would only levy one attack a day. It was clear in hindsight now that they had done this on purpose. The good was that this army seemed to only be built of 500 or so men and women. The bad news, however, was that not only were all their ground units riding mounts, but they also had an aerial unit of more than 50 men and winged beasts. The combined army of Camelot, the Demon Empire and the Empire numbered almost 3,000. But White City wasn't made up of fools. Though it could be argued that the appearance of the Empire on this battlefield should be an unknown variable for White City, there was no way White City didn't have forward scouts, and as such, it was equally impossible that they wouldn't already be aware of the Empire's presence. Yet, they chose to charge forward regardless. Arthur unsheathed his sword, causing a shimmering blade to dance beneath the high sun. "Knights! On me!" His roar shook the battlefield. Holy Road! Arthur's spirit pressure surged as his knees bent. The land beneath his feet cracked as he rocketed forward, a road of golden light following him as he arched across the skies. In a single leap, he crossed into the no-man's land between Camelot's armies and White City's. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. If the Empire still chose to attack them in situation, Camelot was all but finished. Noah watched this in silence, his gaze slowly shifting toward Mordred. But it seemed as though Mordred didn't have any intention of taking the same actions as her father. She continued to face Noah, waiting for him to make a decision. Noah remained silent as though he couldn't feel the rumbling ground and the growing oppressive aura. Without a word, his slow charge toward Mordred shifted directions, cutting an angle across the battlefield and toward White City's charging presence. At that same moment, the remaining 6 knights of the Round Table reacted to Arthur's call. They had to give the demon army and Camelot's army enough time to change face. "Empress!" Mordred shifted her gaze away, looking toward Meralda, who had come rushing back. "What is it? Is the little girl all right?" Yes. I've already passed her along to the medical units." "Then what is the problem?" Meralda sighed. "White City is also attacking for Provost's barony as well. I just received a voice transmission report. We're under siege." Mordred's jaw clenched. In truth, she didn't need to hear this report to know that this would happen. The moment the Empire came here, she knew that her empire was in danger. Though Mordred had returned home and regained a semblance of family, she couldn't just abandon the demons that had allowed her into their fold. The demon empire might not be her home anymore, but it was definitely theirs. A flicker of rage passed through Mordred's pupils. Did they really take her, the demon empress, so lightly? "What's the situation?" "Your Majesty left Krakos in charge. He predicts that he can last about half a day before they have to retreat into the mountains once again. According to the report, there are at least 10 white knights on that battlefield." 10. Mordred's brow furrowed deeper. According to what they knew, there were only 16 to begin with. One of them had been killed by Lionel, so there was only 15. For 10 to be on that battlefield, it was clear that this was all planned out from the very beginning. The worst part of all of this was that it couldn't be forgotten that this moon was a sphere. If White City conquered the Demon Empire, it would be as good as gaining 2 footholds to demolish Camelot with. A dark aura surged around Mordred, causing Meralda to shiver. At that moment, Meralda's talisman glowed once again. "Leave it to me, Em." Mordred's rage suddenly dissipated with the wind. That voice, wasn't that Lionel? He was on the Provost's battlefield? Why was he there? Did he already predict this? "Don't worry, he'll send them packing soon." Mordred could almost see Lionel's grin through the talisman, his air of confidence hanging palpably in the air. Chapter 473. Mordred hesitated, a slight air of guilt hanging around her. She knew, almost better than the man himself, how much Lionel cared about Aina. She felt like she should tell Lionel about Aina's current condition. But at the same time, she knew that Lionel was about to do something foolish again. If he was distracted by other thoughts, his life would definitely be in more danger. Unfortunately, due to the fact Mordred hesitated, Lionel had already disconnected before she could make a final decision, leaving her at a loss. "Empress!" Meralda's call woke Mordred from her stupor. At that moment, Noah and Arthur were already about to clash with the front line of White City's army. Mordred's lost expression became steely, a baleful aura swirling around her. Vast amounts of dark elemental force surged, her black dress fluttering in the wind. Her slender fingers wrapped around a wand as her figure rose into the air. She walked toward the clouds as though the shadows were her stairway to heaven. If Lionel had been here, he would have recognized this ability as being near identical to Little Blackstar's own. Maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that the Demon Empress had become Shadow Sovereign. Whether or not she was a true Shadow Sovereign, or not, remained to be seen. But what was most definitely true was that she had tapped into the same magic system as the little mink. Still, if the outside world knew that Earth had potentially produced two Shadow Sovereigns in the same generation, who knew how they'd react? Those that can fly with me. Mordred's voice wasn't as booming as her father's. In fact, it carried the delicate touch of a woman. Yet it felt no less imposing and grand. It felt as though her commands were irrefutable. At that moment, several demons with bat-like wings shot into the skies under the behest of their queen, tearing a path toward White City's aerial units. Though fatigue was clear in their demeanors, the strength their empress displayed gave them a second wind. They were prepared to follow her to the death. Meralda took several deep breaths on the ground, squeezing her long legs together tightly. Her expression seemed completely inappropriate for the occasion, but what else could you expect from a succubus? She licked her lips, watching Mordred's bottom sway as she stepped into the skies. The Empress is truly too enticing. These damned White City warriors. Meralda felt frustrated. She wanted nothing more than to ravage the Empress right then and there. But with this battle underway, she had no ability to do so. It seemed that her only choice would be to wipe this army and their city lord out first. Demonic heralds of darkness, charge. Meralda's half-excited voice caused the blood of the male demons to surge, her hypnotic suggestion being several times more powerful now than they would be in any other situation. As though maddened beasts, the demons roared into the skies, their savage bearings clashing against White City's momentum. And then the armies met. Are you sure that you can battle? Krako's deep and oddly intellectual voice drifted to Lionel's ears. Huh. Lionel's head snapped up as though he had just woken from a nap. But his reaction only made the number one demon lord even more anxious. Unlike what his confident voice had projected out before, the current Lionel was in a sorry state. He wasn't injured at all. In fact, his body didn't have a scratch on it. But other than that, he looked terrible. Not only did he smell awful, something that was quite surprising to someone like Krakos who had grown up around demons all his life. The bags beneath his eyes were so heavy that they almost formed new layers of skin all to their own. Rivaling even the worst demons in poor hygiene was one matter, but the young man couldn't even keep his eyes open. How exactly was he going to battle? It even seemed like he had sapped up all his remaining energy projecting that confident air to Mordred. After that, he had nothing left to give. Oh yes. Lionel nodded almost too slowly. Everything will be fine. Krako's brow furrowed. At the moment, the demons had only one advantage, the terrain. Whereas Camelot, the Empire and Mordred's troops were currently fighting on endless plains, Krakos had made the decision to retreat to the first line of mountains between No Man's Land and the Demon Empire. But even with this advantage, it might not be enough. According to the scouts, there were more aerial units coming. And, whereas the army led by City Lord White was only made of 500, this one numbered 2,000. They simply weren't properly equipped to deal with such a thing. Lionel's head nodded, and he almost fell over before he caught himself, shaking his head awake again. Here. Lionel shoved a spatial ring at Krakos' chest. But due to their difference in height, Lionel's hand landed on Krakos' abdomen instead. Take these and distribute one of each to the army. This? Krakos' expression changed after his internal sight swept throughout the ring. He was initially going to say something, but he was once again distracted by the state of Lionel's hands. If it wasn't for the fact he was sure Lionel was human, he would have thought that he was actually a zombie demon. Were these really the hands a healthy teenage boy should have? Krakos cleared his throat and peeled Lionel's hand off of his abdomen by pinching two of his fingers around Lionel's wrist. I know that you're a growing boy, but you should really take it easy on the extracurricular activities. Her Majesty has plenty of willing demonesses you can choose from that have quite a favorable impression of you. Lionel didn't even hear Krakos' words, his head nodding to sleep again before snapping awake. Ha. Yes, you're right, whatever. Lionel mumbled. Krakos sighed and walked away. Youths these days, Chapter 474. They've already retreated? An army of 2,000 strong marched forward. Despite the lack of enemies before them, their formation remained neat and organized. In fact, other than the unique sound of synchronized footsteps, the army had been completely silent until this point. At the helm of it all, the warrior who spoke wore black robes accented with white flexible armor. He rode on a scaled horse Lionel would easily recognize as the steed's era, and the other members of the Kafir family had been using when they first ran across him. Of course, the 10 individuals who headed this army were the White Knights of White City. Each of them rode upon one of these scaled horses, their demeanor stoic. It almost seemed out of place for any one of them to speak at all. Among them, 4 were women and the remaining 6 were men. They've likely retreated to the first line of mountains. Another White Knight replied indifferently. Where they've retreated to doesn't matter. Their death is imminent. The White Knights continued forward as though none of them had spoken a word to begin with. With barely a shred of communication, they shifted the direction the army was headed in, making a straight line toward the first line of defense. It was not even a couple hours later that the first line of mountains came into view for the White City army. Sitting atop a mountain peak, Lionel's head nodded to sleep every so often. Yip! Yip! The little mink lightly clawed at Lionel's face, waking him up. Oh, are they here? Lionel asked. Lionel's gaze seemed somewhat sharper. Though the fatigue was still there, it seemed that he had at least rested his mind a bit. But whether it would make much of a difference still remained to be seen. Lionel looked over the horizon. Though Camelot's lands had been dispelled of the perpetual rain, No Man's Land and the Demon Empire still had heavy dark clouds hanging over it. A very familiar light drizzle of acidic rain pitter-pattering ever so softly. From Lionel's vantage point, high up on a mountain peak, he could see the gray, cracked lands White City's army marched through. Lionel stood a bit too quickly, causing his head to spin. More than 30 hours of sleep wasn't enough? Lionel grasped onto his head, sighing lightly. It had technically only been 2 hours of sleep. But, split between his minds, thanks to dream sense, it should have been the equivalent of more than 30. Unfortunately, it seemed that Lionel had underestimated just how much time he would need for his mind to recover. This state should still be more than enough to deal with them. Lionel's gaze grew cold, a calculating indifference reflecting in his eyes. Hold. The acting commander of the White City troops held up a palm. She gazed calmly toward the looming mountains without an ounce of panic. Though they had been constantly sending cannon fodder to the battlefields up to this point, that didn't mean their elites were standing idly by. In fact, they had already thought through their plan of attack thoroughly. Facing this mountain, the acting commander, White Knight Fariolus, already had everything mapped out in her mind. However, the mark of a true commander wasn't so simple. Generals all began by studying the battles of their predecessors before they got the chance to come to the battlefield on their own. But generals who restricted themselves based on what they had read on what were ultimately dead pieces of paper would be forever destined to not reach the pinnacle of warring masters. Fariolus immediately felt that something was off just by laying her eyes on the mountain. There were 3 paths up this mountain, and there was no easy way to travel between them, at least not in large groups. The advantage of the demons was obviously being able to prepare in advance, and having such great terrain to work with. But the advantage for White City was that the demons would have no idea which paths they would pick. The obvious choice for the demons, then, was to destroy 2 of the paths. Due to their narrow and not very safe to begin with structures, this task would have been very easy. This way, they would easily eliminate White City's first advantage by forcing them down a single path. This would have been the perfect plan. Destroying all 3 paths would have shot the Demon Empire in the foot as well. After all, they also needed a path out. So, 2 was the perfect balance of hurting the enemy while helping themselves. Of course, White City had already been prepared for this. As a counter, they had hidden mechanisms within their supply units that would actually allow them to fly over the mountains entirely and assault the palace from the skies. Though the mountainous structures appeared to be terrible from the outside, the location of the Demon Empress Palace was actually a flat of the mountainous land, and, not unlike a castle, acted as its own city. But the problem was that the obvious action the demons should have taken by destroying the 2 paths hadn't been taken at all. From the outside, this seemed to be a good thing. It should have meant that their enemies were more foolish than they thought. But, was this really the case? According to their intelligence, the demons were no less intelligent than humans. In fact, even if they weren't, their empress was a human who should have easily been able to think of this. Could it be that they want to begin the battle on the next mountain range? Did they retreat further back than we assumed? Fariolus thought that there was a good possibility that this could be the case. After all, this initial mountain pass only led to the main mountain range the demon palace could be found. However, if this was the case, their plans would definitely be less effective as the palace would be heavily guarded. Compared to Camelot, the Demon Empire had many more aerial options available to them thanks to the variability of demonkind. Interesting. Fariolus's lip curled. Begin Phase 1. My troop, Roa's troop, Cannon's troop, and Berg's troop will not participate, will be going up the mountain on foot. Hi. White City's warriors got to work immediately, not doubting Fariolus's judgment despite the fact it went against everything they had prepared for. Soon, massive platforms that almost looked like enlarged hot air balloon baskets soared into the air, each carrying dozens of warriors beneath the beating wings of massive birds of prey. At the same time, Fariolus led a troop of the remaining 1,000 on the ground and toward the middle mountain pass, her heart thumping with a will for battle. Chapter 475. So that's their choice? Lionel watched this all happen from afar. It seemed odd that he could see things happening from tens of kilometers away so clearly, but it didn't seem like a problem for him in the slightest. Krakos, lead your men down the middle pass of the mountain. Lionel seemed to speak to empty air. There wasn't a single soul on the mountain peak except for himself. Yet, in the instant he spoke, Krakos' men had moved out under his command. There are 5 white knights in the group you're headed for. All 5 of them have strength surpassing your own, so be sure to follow my orders to a point. Fariolus thought that the demons were planning something secretive, due to their odd actions, when the reality was that Lionel didn't have a large overarching plan. What he did have were many trump cards he was ready to deploy at a moment's notice. The first of these trump cards was Lionel's own personal force disruption towers. To everyone, including those of terrain, force disruption towers had become impossible to use. This only made sense. As the world evolved, the laws of physics that governed it would also fundamentally change. By the current age of technology, the pieces of engineering the people of Earth relied on were inextricably linked to concepts of chemistry, complex studies of physics, and even in some cases, biology. In such a case, as these laws changed, the technology created to make use of them also became useless. Unless Earth adapted to the new changes with new creations of technology every time they evolved, tech would only become more and more useless as time went on. However, Lionel wasn't restricted to Earth's technology at all. Just 2 or so months ago, Lionel had witnessed the engineers of Royal Blue Fort attempt to piece together a force disruption tower. Though they had failed to complete it in the end, Lionel had already taken note of all of the tower's pieces. With the level his mind had reached, and the fact the towers were created based on third-dimensional constructs, memorizing everything with a glance was as easy as breathing for Lionel. After witnessing everything, it only became a matter of reverse engineering it all. However, even then Lionel didn't need to go so far. What he needed wasn't a true working force disruption tower. After all, they had become nearly useless after Earth entered the 4th dimension. No, what Lionel needed was just a framework, a push in the right direction, a small light at the end of the tunnel. That would be enough to bring the warriors of White City hell. Fariolus led the vanguard through the mountain pass. Rock walls surrounded them from all directions almost as though they had entered a dark valley, rather than a passage up a mountain. Though the passage was considered narrow, this was only in consideration for an army of 1,000 strong. The truth was that there was still 20 meters of clearance between the walls of the mountain pass. Still, with an army of this size, such a reality made quickly retreating almost an impossibility. But Fariolus wasn't a fool. She was already prepared for any unexpected situations. The reality was that whenever you were an army laying siege, losses would be inevitable. She entered this pass knowing very well that it might be a trap, but she was prepared to suffer whatever consequences might come with it. This was the philosophy of the White City Knights. They as commanders rode in the vanguard. They as commander took the brunt of the pressure on their shoulders. They as commanders would face all danger that came their way. It was this top-down philosophy that bred the fearless army of White City. When your commanders dared to lead the charge, what right did they as subordinates have to cower? Farialis's gaze narrowed. The ground only shifted a bit, but she sensed it. Her sensitivity to such things was beyond normal limits, not only due to her experience as a commander, but most importantly due to her ability. This was the second reason she dared to enter this narrow passageway. Farialis's ability made her exceptionally sensitive to vibrations through the ground. But what shocked her wasn't the fact there were vibrations, but rather that these vibrations were so normal. This rhythm, it could only come from an advancing troop. Farialis internally sneered. It couldn't be that they wanted to meet on this battlefield, right? Had she really overthought it? Did the demons just overestimate themselves? Though the report said that the demons were just as intelligent as humans, it also said that they were quite hot-blooded as well. They may very well be like their City Lord White, but completely lacking in the strength City Lord White had. Still, though Farialis thought this, she went on her guard, stopping the army at one of the many winding paths. This is the best location to meet them. The current location had the White City army still moving uphill, which put them at a slight disadvantage. But in return, the bend in the path more than made up for this. The vast majority of people were right-handed. This was the case across the universe and across races. The position Farialis chose to stop at gave those with a dominant right hand the advantage. But this was only a small part of the puzzle. The main reason Farialis chose this location was because the demon army would have to curl around the path to meet them, whereas White City's army could meet them head-on. If the demons were really as hot-headed as they seemed, they would easily fall into this small trap. Farialis pulled out a sword while unsheathing a dagger with her left. This was her in her optimal state. 1.5 length sword in her right and a short sword in her left. She had lost count of the number of enemies she had slaughtered with these two blades. They stopped. Farialis's gaze narrowed. It seemed she was correct to be cautious. A battle intent exuded from her body. Without a single word, the warriors to her back felt her excitement, their blood beginning to boil as well. Activate it now. Lionel's expressionless voice shook Krako's heart. Was this the same boy he had just been with? But, without hesitation, Krakos gave the hand signal. In unison, the demons brandished their weapons, pouring all the force they could muster into them. In that instant, the quality of the air seemed to shift. The mountain pass gained an abnormal stillness. Charge! Lionel commanded. A long distance away, in a military recovery tent on the Camelot battlefield, Aina tossed and turned, her breathing short and ragged. Strong pulsing veins coursed through her body, bulging throughout her neck. The military tent soared past 100 degrees Celsius and seemed to still be climbing. Chapter 476. City Lord White held a combat prowess those of Earth had simply never seen before. If it wasn't for Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Noah and Jessica all surrounding her at once, it felt like she could solo the entire battlefield on her own. Yet even with so many working together, she didn't seem to be even slightly disadvantaged. In fact, she even held the upper hand, her strength causing the skies to tremble and the earth to quake. City Lord White swung Clara with a single hand, sending King Arthur flying backward. Arthur's feet dug a deep pit in the ground, his body sinking down into a strong horse stance as he held Excalibur across his body. City Lord White's irises glittered somewhat. She was inwardly shocked, not because of the strength of the enemy she faced, but rather because of the quality of their weapons. Logically speaking, it was impossible for such a fledgling world to have such powerful weapons. Their weakness should also come with an appropriate lack of resources. Yet this wasn't the case at all. In fact, if it wasn't for White City being severely outclassed in weaponry, this war might have come to an end long ago. Just as an example, there was the sword in Arthur's hands. It shouldn't have been able to survive even a single strike from her before shattering. Yet, not only did it not show any signs of collapsing, it was even faintly putting pressure on her double-headed weapon. As though that wasn't bad enough, there was Arthur's white armor. Though City Lord White wasn't a weapons expert, she could still tell that Arthur's armor reinforced his force and deflected almost 10% of her attacks. If it wasn't for her sturdy build, City Lord White would have suffered a great deal. If it was just Arthur, things might have been fine. But there was still Noah's saber and Jessica's whip. In fact, even the Knights of the Round Table all had weapons and armor superior to her own. This was especially the case for Lancelot and his golden lance. It felt that if she was even a little careless, she would be pierced all the way through. On terrain, such weapons simply didn't exist. Though worlds could have heirlooms they passed down at this quality, and being in her position, City Lord White would definitely be in position to have one such weapon. It had to be remembered that terrain was deemed as a world without talent. As a result of this, terrain never received the support of higher dimensional worlds, and as such never received rewards for their zones. The only benefit of clearing zones for terrain was helping their world to survive another day, and maybe the training they could receive by putting their lives on the line. This was the reality of the world. There was no such thing as fairness. Terrain didn't receive the support of higher dimensional worlds because they weren't talented. By the same token, these higher dimensional worlds had no obligation to help Earth either. Like this, City Lord White faced enemies with Tier 9 black and quasi-bronze treasures all around while she herself only wielded a Tier 7 black treasure. She treated like her own child. Yet, despite the situation, a maddening grin hung across her attractive face. Her slender arms bulged with strength it shouldn't have, blasting another 2 Knights of the Round Table away. Come. Show me more. I haven't bled in a long time. Can you let me see the color of my blood? City Lord White's laughter rang throughout the battlefield. Her voice was like a beacon in the darkness for her men, constantly fueling their momentum. How could their blood not boil? Even when so many faced their commander at once, they were simply no match for her. Noah brandished his blue-bladed saber. If those who weren't aware of his abilities saw him now, they would be stunned. Normally, Noah was just around 2 meters tall. But now he stood at over 5, his body exuding the valiant air of a god descended from the skies. His blade increased in size with him, swinging down at City Lord White with a might that made the wind tremble. Good. City Lord White flicked her wrist upward, easily deflecting Noah's saber as though it was no heavier than a feather. She reset herself, looking to swing at and shatter Noah's knee, but Jessica reacted quickly, causing several demonic beasts to pounce at the City Lord. However, City Lord White's sinister grin only grew wider. As though it put no pressure on her wrists at all, she easily shifted her aim with a thought, shattering the skulls of 3 beasts with a single flicker. Noah felt as though his arm was about to shatter beneath the she-devil's counterattack. His ability wasn't as simple as gigantification. He could increase the size of his body and any object he so chose, but he could also control density along with this ability. Everyone knew that volume increased by a cubic while surface area increased by a square. This meant that there was a limit to how large the human body could become before it collapsed in on itself. However, Noah could bypass this by increasing the density of his bones several-fold at will. Even making his bones as strong as diamond wasn't impossible with his current ability. In the future, making himself as durable as a 4th-dimensional or higher metals would just be a thought away. This was all to say that Noah could make his own weight increase to an inconceivable degree, and he would also be able to proportionally increase his muscle density to have the strength to back it up. Yet, City Lord White deflected it all with a flick of her wrist. At that moment, King Arthur dug himself out of the trench he had slid back in, charging back toward City Lord White with the same valiant air. Golden lights surged around his body, dancing along with his blade as he cleaved forward. City Lord White's laughter sounded as she sent him flying once more. In the blink of an eye, she appeared amidst the Knights of the Round Table, forcing them to quickly defend themselves. But the result was only to be expected. Blood flew from their lips as they were sent flying. City Lord White shot forward, appearing before King Arthur, her double-headed hammer already swinging downward, a manic laughter hanging in the air. King Arthur's visage remained stoic, slamming a palm into the ground and flipping out of the way. However, City Lord White's nimbleness was beyond his comprehension. With a twist of her wrist, her target changed like flowing water, aimed right for King Arthur's head. Arthur's gaze sharpened, the scent of death hanging over him. He could almost feel the Grim Reaper whispering into his ears. With the quickest movements he could muster, he rose Excalibur to his face, trying to block it. City Lord White's laughter didn't pause for even a moment. She could almost smell the blood spraying into the air. It was at that moment that a strong surge of magic shook the battlefield. A shield of ice quickly formed in the path of City Lord White's hammer, causing it to slow and pause just for a moment before being shattered. By then, King Arthur had already taken advantage of the opportunity to dodge out of the way, City Lord White's hammer just scraping a hair's breadth from his head. In the distance, the blue eyes of Queen Guinevere shone like two sparkling sapphire gems. The Queen of Camelot had stepped onto the battlefield for the first time in decades. Chapter 477. Queen Guinevere's spirit pressure seemed to make the skies bow down. It was only at this moment that the people of Camelot and the Demon Empire realized that the strongest mage of Camelot wasn't the Pope, nor was it Arthur, nor was it even Mordred. It was the Queen of the People, Guinevere Pendragon. Ho ho. Good. The more the merrier. City Lord White's laughter continued, brandishing her hammer to smash toward King Arthur again, as though she hadn't sensed Guinevere's presence in the least. Sharp, icy winds spun around the queen, her black hair rapidly becoming coated in a thin layer of ice. In an instant, her tan skin and black hair became as white as snow, her eyes becoming such a pale shade of blue that they too seemed to become white. Several javelins of ice formed to her back, shattering the sound barrier as they shot forward. The mages of Camelot immediately reeled in shock. They couldn't wrap their minds around how the queen displayed such prowess without her wand. At that moment, City Lord White became more serious. She wasn't a well-informed person. All she knew was battle. If it wasn't related to brandishing her hammer, she didn't want to hear about it. But what she did have were instincts honed over countless years of endless battle. So though she didn't know the name of the exact innate force node Queen Guinevere had awakened, she knew that it couldn't be a weak one. City Lord White swung her hammer toward the incoming ice javelins. The shattering of ice resounded through the battlefield, gorgeous snowflakes wildly fluttering at the point of contact. Under the astonished gazes of many, City Lord White took a single step back. Though it was just one, it filled King Arthur and the others with fighting spirit. This wild she-devil had finally shown a weakness. In the skies, Mordred finally sighed a breath of relief. When Arthur almost died, she felt her heart seize. She never thought that she would have such a strong reaction to the almost death of her father. It seemed that blood was truly thicker than water. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to come down from the skies. If she let the aerial units of White City run rampant, this battle would be over as soon as it started. Luckily, her mother had come to the battlefield. Under normal circumstances, King Arthur would never allow her to. In fact, the only reason he allowed Mordred to battle at all was because he didn't really have a choice. After all, she was the ruler of the demons. If she wasn't here, who would take command of them exactly? There was a reason Lyones couldn't be found on the battlefield. Guinevere's appearance caused the landscape of the war to shift once again. City Lord White was constantly placed on her back foot, her hammer deflecting Guinevere's barrage of ice javelins. Guinevere's ranged assault put even Lionel to shame. To be able to put so much power into each strike, it was well beyond anything the current Lionel could do. It was hard to believe that Camelot still had such a trump card in the wings. It seemed that the awakening of Guinevere's ability made her powerful beyond belief. Taking advantage of Guinevere keeping City Lord White pinned down, the others began to act as well, pincering the City Lord from all sides. King Arthur activated Light Domain, sending a barrage of light projectiles toward City Lord White as well. Noah brandished his saber, using the openings Queen Guinevere created to send out strikes of his own. In the blink of an eye, it seemed as though everything had flipped on its head. Even City Lord White's laughter seemed to have come to a grinding halt. However, those who assaulted her didn't seem capable of relaxing even for a moment. No, it wasn't that they weren't capable, but rather that they couldn't. City Lord White's laughter may have come to a close, but the look on her face sent shivers down all of their spines. Her grin became wider and wider, a sinister darkness cascading over her face. The solemn atmosphere of the battlefield seemed to grow several-fold. It was as though City Lord White's lack of laughter was even more of a sign than her actual laughter had been. And the only ones who seemed to be in the dark about this were the experts locked in battle with her. Good. 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 Now I can finally go all out. In the distance, Naya watched on, a clipboard being hugged against her chest. She shook her head, lamenting the state of things. It would have been better if they were too weak, at least then City Lord wouldn't truly go berserk. Naya sighed. How will we reel her in this time? Naya began to rack her brain. As far as she was concerned, this battle was as good as over. She only hoped that her City Lord didn't sink too far in this time. Blood. 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 City Lord White's cry almost manifested like a banshee's. It was a shrill shriek that could cause one's blood to curdle, and one's heart to stop. At that moment, City Lord White's short hair suddenly began to wildly grow. In the blink of an eye, it became like a river of crimson floating in the air. What was even more shocking, though, was the change to her eyes. In a moment, the whites of her eyes became a blood red, while her irises became a murky gray. No matter how one looked at her, she looked like a demon incarnate. But as though to ensure those who didn't think so saw through to the truth of the situation, corpses from all around the battlefield trembled. Then, in the blink of an eye, they were completely drained, streams of blood from their dead bodies shooting into the air, and pouring into City Lord White's hair as though to nurture it. Blood. 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 City Lord White's laughter once again sounded, but this time, it felt as though 3 women were laughing at once, then it was 4, then 5. Very soon, it was impossible to tell that they were women at all. When everyone realized what was happening, their eyes widened in shock. It wasn't City Lord White's laughter anymore at all. In fact, other than the mad grin on her face, City Lord White's mouth didn't open at all. The laughter, it was coming from the blood. It was the voices of the dead piercing through the veil of the living as though to remind them all not to forget. City Lord White shot forward, her speed more than triple what it had been before. In less than a breath, she appeared before Lancelot, her hammer swinging forth. Lancelot reacted as quickly as he could, piercing forward and up with his lance. But a vibrant red glow that pulsed like a beating heart appeared on City Lord White's hammer as it smashed downward. At the instant of contact, Lancelot felt pain like he never had before. The bones in his legs collapsed in on themselves, what remained of his knee piercing through his skin in gruesome fashion. All the strength he had accumulated seemed to be no better than a child swinging with all their might at an adult. In all his life, Lancelot had never felt so weak, nor had he ever suffered through such pain. Lancelot! Arthur, Guinevere and the Knights of the Round Table all shouted in rage at once. But, City Lord White's laughter was like a melodious tune being plucked to their suffering. At that moment, within a military healing tent, the temperature had already skyrocketed past 200 degrees Celsius. The heartbeat of the young girl had grown so loud that it could be heard even outside the flapping curtains. It was in that instant that her eyes shot open, reflecting a blinding golden light. Blood! The voice was soft, but it seemed to reach the ears of every person on the battlefield. Chapter 478. A year ago, Aina stood from her seated position. Power she had never felt before coursing through her veins. She had already expected that the blood of a fifth-dimensional creature would give her a massive boost to her strength, but she was still somewhat surprised that it allowed her to directly shatter the barrier to the fourth dimension. The fourth dimension was different from the third. It could be said that both planes of existence laid a foundation, but the method in which they did so was much different. In order to understand what this difference was, it had to be known that the minimum requirement for passing down a lineage factor was being in existence at the fourth dimension. Only upon gaining some mastery of this dimension would one reach the necessary threshold. The third dimension formed one's force nodes. The number one managed to form would remain unchanged, at least for the time being. This made one's success within the third dimension a direct predictor of one's success in the future. The fourth dimension built upon this foundation. Not only did one transition from third-dimensional to fourth-dimensional force, but one also began the process of body refinement. Though it seemed like dimensions were just power levels, this wasn't the case at all. When transitioning between dimensions, one was quite literally ascending to a new plane of existence. This was why the gap between dimensions was impossible to cross. The third dimension allowed one to create fourth-dimensional constructs within one's body, the force nodes. While the fourth dimension was the process of dispelling what impurities remained of the third and fourth dimensions, to allow a smooth transition into the fifth dimension. At the fifth dimension, this was where the true powerful existences of the dimensional verse began to appear. As such, there was one main goal of the fourth dimension: to purify, whether that be the blood, the bones, the organs. Everything needed to be cleansed of filth lingering from lesser dimensions. Only by doing this would it be possible to ascend to a higher level of being. However, unlike the third dimension, there wasn't just one method of completing this requirement. In fact, the fourth dimension was where the numerous diverging paths of the dimensional verse truly began to shine. For someone like Aina, the path she would choose was very simple. With her ability, it only made sense to focus on her blood. The blood was the life liquid the remainder of the body relied on. There wasn't a single crevice one could find in the body where it wasn't a major player. And thanks to Aina's affinities and her ability, this was also among the easiest paths for her to take. As for how the power level of the fourth dimension worked, this was much more straightforward. In order to transition from the use of third-dimensional force to fourth-dimensional force, the body had to be properly primed. Only by ridding oneself of these impurities would one be able to truly begin to use fourth-dimensional force. Upon reaching the first tier, one would be able to fill one of their force nodes with fourth-dimensional force. Upon reaching the second tier, one would be able to withstand the filling of two force nodes with fourth-dimensional force. So on and so forth. However, one can easily see from this how divisions might be caused due to one's level of success within the third dimension. Not only were the sizes of everyone's force nodes different, but even the amount of force nodes one formed weren't all consistently the same. This meant that two individuals who could be considered Tier 1 fourth-dimensional existences could be of vastly different strengths. And the effort they had to put in to reach this level would definitely vastly differ as well. But only upon reaching Tier 1 would one truly be considered a fourth-dimensional existence. As though all of this wasn't complicated enough, the universe seemed to hate making things neat and tidy. By now, those with sharp minds would have realized that though forming large force nodes and reaching the maximum level of 9 gave one an advantage, it would also be easy to realize that this didn't restrict one from continuing to purify one's body. Even if you only formed 3 force nodes, and could already sustain fourth-dimensional force in them all, what was stopping you from continuing to refine and purify your body? For example, compared to Lionel, Aina's force nodes were much smaller, not even close to Lionel's 100 cell size. And though she had managed to form 9 of them, her talent in energy manipulation was low due to her lack of talent with internal sight. Unfortunately, both of these things would be linked. However, compared to others, Aina's talent in refining her body were leagues beyond. Lionel could only rely on his lineage factor to match her in this regard. What did all of this mean? It meant that technically, one could have a poor showing and set a terrible foundation within the third dimension, yet still become an undefeatable existence within the fourth dimension. Aina was one such person. Though her foundation within the third dimension couldn't be considered to be bad, it wasn't among the very best either. However, her talent for growth within the fourth dimension was beyond what most could fathom. In fact, without having spent even a single minute within the fourth dimension, Aina had already cleared the requirements to be considered a Tier 2 fourth-dimensional existence. Of course, this was mostly in thanks due to the abyssal panther blood she just ingested. That said, how many others could ingest fifth-dimensional blood in the third and live to tell about it? Aina flexed her body, basking beneath the popping of her joints. Other than the discomfort her inflamed scars were bringing her, she had never felt more at ease in her life. Her blood thrummed and her heart gave out long and steady beats. She felt as though she could shatter the world with a single fist. It's time for me to find a path out of here. Though Tier 2 fourth dimensional strength is good, they were at least at Tier 4 or 5 in strength. Aina's Tier 2 strength was likely worth more than a usual Tier 3 existence on terrain due to the size of her force nodes. Though she couldn't compare to Lionel, that didn't mean she lost out to those with such poor talent. But leaping over any more would be troublesome, at least when she was facing so many of them at once. Plus, there were other factors to strength than just one's base powerful level like styles and embryos. Aina still needed to train herself more. So she traveled deeper into the cave, not knowing a thing about the horrible experience that lied in wait for her. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.